If you don't mind, mute yourselves if you haven't done so already. We're going to try to keep this as clean as possible. Tony and I are teaching this class. This is Strategies of a Purchase Contract. So we're going to go in kind of deep and discuss the tool that we use most often, which is the purchase contract. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. We're going to get started in just a quick moment here.
Is that the same as a Minnesota Minute?
That's the. Okay, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you guys see my screen? Awesome, thank you. All right, so I'm going to rest it here for just a second. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, guys, my name is Chad Shimabukuro. I'm one of the brokers in charge here, Tony Pace. He's also a well-established, very experienced broker. We're going to be teaching you strategies of a purchase contract. If you have any questions, if you have any ahas or anything like that, please put them in the chat. We're trying to keep the audio as clear as possible since Tony and I are sharing a microphone and a speaker. And we wanted to go over a handful of things with you. Basically, you know, the way I look at the purchase contract, and it's going to be kind of a dialogue between Tony and I so that we can give you our best practices and experience too. But I really look at the purchase contract as a tool, just like a carpenter has a tool. You know, you really got to know what each tool is used for to better strategize, in the case of a carpenter, to build a shelf or whatever it is. But for us in real estate, I mean, how can you have your client's best, your goals and priorities in mind if you don't know how to write that purchase contract? I don't know about you, but in my opinion, I see this often when I'm reviewing contracts is a lot of agents are using templates.
Yeah.
And if you're writing and using a template and you're applying the same thought process for 15 different clients, they clearly don't have the same goal and priority. I mean, they want to get the home, right? But the timeline might be different. The home itself, the condition of the home might be different, thus requiring either a longer or maybe even a shorter home inspection period or a variety of different things. So something very helpful to know is that purchase contract, if you're a wizard at that purchase contract, it really is like playing chess. Like you can outmaneuver that other agent or think, you know, a few steps ahead and how you structure that. Would you agree with that?
Sure. And I think like if you're writing, you know, multiple offers for one client and, you know, property A doesn't get accepted, so you go to property B, I think in that case, you can use a template from property A to property B. But if you got a client Jones and a client Smith, their priorities are totally different. And you may miss something that Chad and I won't know, especially on some of the timelines, you know, appliances, PV, included, not included, you know, things of that sort.
Yeah.
Because we just had somebody who sold the property and put in there that there was a solar system included, which it wasn't. And so he had to come out of pocket for a new solar system, you know, for the buyer. He represented the seller.
So, you know, the contract is a double-edged sword in many respects. Not only if you do one thing, could it, you know, benefit the buyer, it could also be used against you with the seller. But in this case too, if you're writing the contract and it's ill prepared or you're not looking at what you're putting together, it could cost you money literally out of your own pocket, out of your own commission too. A good real estate agent, in my mind, is one that encompasses both the front end of things, the sales part of it, as well as the back end part of it, which is protecting your client, the fiduciary responsibility, understanding the contract portion of it. And in my opinion, a good realtor helps people to make good decisions. It's not always about sales, right? So a lot of times people are like, oh, he's a great realtor. Well, why? Because he does X amount of production. You know, you want to, again, it's both the front office and the back office part of it, which is salesmanship is absolutely important, but how you care for, treat and handle the contract and represent their best interests is extremely important, to the extent that you can be sued, lose your license, have revocation, and all these other kind of things as a result of it. So just making sure that everybody knows. We have a couple of videos in here. If you guys can't see the video, please let me know and I'll fix it, but I'm going to move on. Take a look.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
Obviously, that's just a little fun video, but the whole point of it too, right, is it's not obviously what you always think that is there's things under the surface. You got to listen. We all got to listen and kind of learn and grow. So what is today's goal? It's to better understand the purchase contract. We'll give you some purchase contract tips and tricks and some hacks, so to speak, how to stay out of trouble. We'll get you some resources as well. Guys, take notes. It's super, super important. In fact, we're required to take notes, just like a physician would write down the symptoms and so forth. It's really important that we all take notes. And you know, at the end of the day, having access to those notes will better prepare you for how to handle your client. And one thing that Tony mentioned just the other day, which I think is perfect, and definitely how you should interact with your client, is assume that every transaction that you open will end up in litigation. Assume that it will. So document things the way in which that you want to avoid that litigation, or if an attorney, a judge, a jury, or anything else were to question you about what your intention was or what was documented, what your goals were, that you have everything written down. So make sure that you do that. Another quick little video.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones.
Oops. So sorry. Sorry about that. Well, anyways, the point of that video was it's kind of brilliant, because it seems like nothing has changed, but in fact they've changed a ton of different things while you weren't paying attention. And to me, how that translates to the purchase contract is similar. Is that you think the purchase contract is kind of just a simple thing, but what you do can absolutely change, or what you don't understand could be much different. So what we want to do today is get a clearer understanding of what that purchase contract is and what it looks like and how you can benefit and strategize for it. So what's the most important thing that you need to know before writing your offer? So we talked about this before. This is the number one thing which we started mentioning as well, which is your clients, in this case, the buyer, their goals and priorities. That's the number one thing that you need to know before writing an offer is what your client's goals and priorities are. And I say that because you could have a client that is military that maybe isn't here yet, hasn't relocated here yet or PCS'd here yet. We have that all the time. We deal with that kind of stuff all the time. And their goal and priority is to maybe secure a property before they arrive, at least to get it into escrow, or to start maybe having you find a handful of properties for them. Or maybe a military client's already here. And as you guys know, they only have usually a very small window, 10 to 14 days to try to find a property. We're dealing with one, right now. And so that priority is going to look much different than someone else. So you really got to have a clear understanding of what your buyer's goals and priorities are. And that should drive everything. And that's not something that you just find out on day one and that's the same thing, because that thing could change, right? As you go through escrow, you go through the home inspection and, they say, this is a great one that happens all the time. Hey, I'm okay with the fixer-upper. And you go through J1 and all the findings are like, I'm not really, this is too much of a fixer-upper. And that's not really a fixer-upper, or we don't have the same definition of a fixer-upper. So you really have to constantly go back to that well and always ask, like, what's the goal and priority of the client, and am I keeping their best interest in mind? So let's get started on page 1. Let's see, I have a different view on my screen, so I apologize. I'm just kind of moving things around here. So page 1 of the purchase contract, before you write an offer, it's always advisable for you to call the listing agent and ask, number one, first and foremost, is do you have any offers in hand? And if so, how many and how strong are those offers? That's really important to find out. When are you presenting offers to the seller? Obviously that's important, right? Because if you're not going to be meeting your buyer until Wednesday, and today is Monday, for instance, and they're presenting offers, today, that's going to put you in a precarious position time-wise. Here's another one that I think is absolutely brilliant to ask is, besides price, what's important to the seller? I have been in a situation before where I have had an accepted offer and I wasn't the highest priced offer. A lot of times people just assume that the highest price offer is going to win, but you don't know the nuance behind certain circumstances. There's been times where I found out that the seller wanted a rent back. I found out that the seller may have wanted a longer closing. So you think in your mind, I'm going to write it with 25-day closing or something like that, because you assume that that's what the seller wants. But what if the seller wants a 90-day close? Or they want rent back, or they want to, maybe the seller doesn't have a lot of proceeds. So the buyer is okay with paying some of the seller expenses, right? All these different things are things that you should be asking. So besides price, what's important to the seller? Also, you can ask, are there any pertinent items to disclose? Tony points out too that it's really important to make sure that you look at the MLS. The supplements section could contain an SRPDS, it could contain a survey, it could have HOA documents or litigation documents. Oftentimes as agents, we rush to putting an offer together without doing a little bit of research. And in reality, our license requires us to do a little research. Yeah, especially now with even just for showings, like a lot of times in the remarks section of MLS, they want you to take a look at the COVID addendum. They want you to sign it before anybody even goes to view the property, and they want a pre-approval letter to make sure that, hey, your buyers are serious and they have been on island for more than 14 days and they're out of quarantine and they're following procedures for social distancing and not partying out. And so the last couple of properties that we've had to look for, I have my client sign it and I just submit it automatically for every showing request. Here's their pre-approval letter and here's all the COVID forms already executed. Also note that, there are some companies that, they have their own addenda that they want to use in the purchase contract. And it's important not only just to use it, but to make sure you know exactly what's inside. There's a lot of addenda out there that if you're not reading it, it changes the terms of some of the contract language. And then when you think you have, extra leeway, extra time, you realize that you
you don't, because it's been taken out, you know, through the addenda, which supersedes anything that's in the purchase contract. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and not to mention the specific firms or companies in this forum, but as Tony had mentioned, there are some rather large and even some smaller boutique firms that might ask you to insert their standard addendum. So what Tony's saying, which is extremely important for you to know, is if you plan on making any document, whether it's a standard form or especially one of another firm's document, making that part of the purchase agreement, you got to read it. You got to read it and understand what it is, how it may be impacting or changing the language in the purchase contract, and more importantly, how it may be changing the buyer's goals and priorities. So the sentence down at the bottom there is now that you have this information, now what? What do you do with it? Well, what you do with it is you properly advise your buyer. So maybe you have a SRPDS, maybe you have a copy of that firm's addendum, maybe you have some other disclosure. What do you do with it? Well, you understand it yourself and you go and revisit it with your buyer to make sure that, are we still writing an offer on this property because now we have this information or that information or whatever that might look like. So we're not in the business of just blindly submitting offers. We really need to make sure that we advise our clients properly and consult with them. If you guys look at A2 on the purchase contract, I'm going to pull up my purchase contract and follow along too. But a couple of things is oftentimes, you know, we've taught this class a handful of times. This iteration of the purchase contract has been around since May of 2019. If you think about it, it's not that old. We've had a little bit of distance. We've had a little bit of time where we can now have more anecdotal experience and some examples that we can apply and give and share with you guys or whatever, but it's not that old. However, there are things that I see often in both this iteration of the contract as well as the previous, which is many agents don't use NA, like they just leave things blank. Don't do that. And also, by the way, too, on section Q, don't put, well, I've seen this before too, all blanks deemed NA. Don't put that. That's not what I'm referring to. I mean, literally in the space, like if you look at A2A, A2B, A2C, whatever is not applicable, just put NA in that specific area of the contract.
Because page 1 only has to do with agency. So if you're writing a contract on a KW listing, it's going to be a dual agency situation, you know, send over the dual agency agreement or disclosure to your client ahead of time so they know exactly what they're getting into, because, you know, paragraph A1C is only like 5 sentences long, but, you know, the dual agency consent form is like, what, 1 or 2 pages?
It's 2 pages.
2 pages, yeah. Right? So there's a lot more detailed information in there, and your client may say, you know, I don't want a dual agency. You know, go find me a property that's listed by another brokerage company, so I want you to represent me and represent me only.
And there's different types of, at the end of the day, the law applies to all of it, and it's kind of a sweeping move for dual agency, but there's different nuances to dual agency. You as an agent you personally could be representing both the buyer, and you personally could be representing the seller. But another more common for us as large of a firm as we are is there's, you know, salesperson A is representing the buyer, salesperson B is representing the seller under Keller Williams, but the buyer and seller don't know each other. The 2 agents may not even know each other or certainly not working with each other, but that's still considered dual agency as well. So make sure that you understand dual agency and make sure that your client, to Tony's point, acknowledges and agrees to being represented as dual agency. So A2, if it is dual agency, make sure that you use the proper name of our firm. Oftentimes agents will send in KW or KWH or KW Honolulu. Put the full legal name, Keller Williams Honolulu. A2D, if one of the parties is not represented at all, such as a FSBO for sale by owner, use this section to properly inform that party that they are a customer and not a client. Tony, can you give us some examples or what the difference is, so if everyone can make sure they understand what the difference between a customer and client are?
A customer is that you just treat somebody fairly. You get to disclose everything about that person to the seller if you're representing the seller, or vice versa. As where a fiduciary, you can't disclose anything to either side. You just have to treat them both in a neutral, as a neutral person.
So in other words, everyone that you come in contact with in dealing in real estate, we owe professionalism, we owe honesty and fair dealings with. The real difference is the fiduciary responsibility. And that's important. That's important to the extent that our license is on the line as a result of that. So make sure that you understand that. Tip, Earnest money deposits are a great way to negotiate a contract. It is one of a few components that show the strength of an offer. Instead of having a buyer put down $10,000 on the initial deposit, for example, you can consider splitting that up. You can do $2,500, $7,500, or $5,000, $5,000. So why structure the earnest money like this is a good question. And who determines the structure and the amounts of the earnest money? So Tony and I kind of wanted to bounce some ideas past Tony to get his thoughts and experience on this as well. But for me personally, the tidbit that I would like to add is when you guys are structuring earnest money deposit, what should lead the conversation is how many offers that they have in hand. Like, who are you competing with? Because if you're not competing with anyone, you can absolutely put a far more reasonable earnest money deposit down. If there's a lot of competition, you might have to increase that. You might have to put more in the initial deposit than you would, if at all, on the secondary deposit. But one thing that our legal counsel, if you guys have taken any classes with Kimo Stone, has mentioned many times is, when you deposit money into earnest money, you almost have to have that mindset, and the buyer has to have that mindset that they're parting ways with that money. Can they get it back if they cancel on a contingency? Sure, more often they do, but they are parting ways with that money. And in this state, at least, both sides, the buyer and the seller, have to agree to release that money and where it's released to. So you don't want to take that lightly. Just because you could cancel on J1, you cancel on a lot of different things. It doesn't mean that with absolute certainty you're going to get that earnest money back. So you want to structure it the right way. The other thing too is the benefit to me of having that secondary deposit is you could still have a large, in this case, a $10,000 deposit and put down $2,500 initially and $7,500 maybe after the home inspection. Because in my experience, having done this for a while, most of the reasons why an escrow falls apart or cancels is a result of the findings of the home inspection. So if you back in that secondary deposit tied to, for instance, 2 days after J1 satisfaction, that still gets you to that $10,000, but it eliminates, and the buyer now might feel a little bit more comfortable with what the findings are of that home inspection. What's some of your thought process and experience on this?
I kind of like to spread it out. If your clients are willing to come up with 20,000 total, I would spread out like maybe 5 and 15, 10 and 10. Just make them realize is that that their deposits are at risk. So if they put a big initial deposit down and no additional deposit, and then something goes wrong where they default in the contract, their earnest money deposit is at risk for loss. So if you've got the $20,000 initial deposit, they could lose that, and that's a big loss as compared to like $2,500 on the initial, right? So you want to make sure that your client understands that his money's at risk, not only for being lost, but also for being tied up. Because you can go ahead and cancel a contract. It doesn't mean they're going to get it back right away. So how much money do they want to have tied up in escrow that prevents them from putting a deposit on an additional property should the first one fall out? Because nothing is canceled until it's agreed upon between the buyer and seller through escrow cancellation instructions. So unless you write something in the contract, all deposits are returned to the buyer within 10 days of cancellation, like stipulated in Section Q.
Yeah, and it's tricky too. The other thing that I've come across as well is if you read it, it does state on there that the buyer will get their earnest money returned to them upon cancellation, depending on what section of the contract you're canceling on, and we'll get to that later on. But in this state, for better or worse, escrow doesn't interpret the contract. Again, I say for better or worse because there are some states that the escrow officer will interpret that, and if they interpret it in your favor, you're like, oh, thank God, this is such a great escrow officer. But if they favor the other side, you're going to be upset. So in this state, they always got to get permission back and forth. So even though it says that, I also know too that some escrow companies here, even if you add it in Q1, they may or may not honor that. It's going to come down to their own internal policy for that escrow company. So it's just something to bear in mind. Another question that came up was what the amount of earnest money should be. I'll chime in, and I'd love to your opinion too, is it also depends on what kind of loan and what kind of financing you're doing as well. Also, how many offers are competing. That's what I mean about there's no template. There's no template because there's so many moving parts to how you can put this thing together. If you're doing a USDA, an FHA, or a VA, a government loan, or sometimes we call a Govy loan. Those loans, just by its very nature, typically have a smaller, it doesn't have to, but it typically has a smaller earnest money deposit. Again, because VA and USDA both have no money down, typically, and FHA has a smaller amount of money down. But if you have, even a VA that you're making an offer, which Tony's working on right now, but if you have a VA that is upwards of 800, 900, even $1 million, I mean, you kind of, the $1,000 minimum VA earnest money kind of goes out the window, because unless there's no offers, it's been sitting on the market for a while and you're not competing with anyone, maybe you can do that. But at the end of the day, those properties are there's probably some other competition on it. And you would do yourself a service by making something more realistic. So 1% of the purchase price is kind of reasonable. But I also know that it kind of depends on the competition. What would you say to that, Tony?
I would say, first off, make sure your clients, if you're working with a USDA or VA buyer, that they have the funds for the initial additional deposit. We have a case where, the buyers, they can't come up with the additional funds. So they may get, pushed out of contract. It's kind of like, make sure your people are on the up and up. And also, if it's a VA buyer and they have some cash, like 10, 20,000, and they're looking at a million, 1.5 million, they can put the initial deposit and the initial deposits up to 10, 20,000 and just write in the contract that, they get it back. They get it back at closing, provided that they get the right financing, right? That's how it works. But, the more the better, when you're dealing with more expensive properties, so always take a look at, am I going to take my property off the market for $1,000? Like, no. Am I going to take my property off the market for $100,000? Maybe no, depending on the price range, right? So if you've got a big, expensive property, the more the better, especially if you're competing. Because, today, we're looking at offers 20, 30,000, 20, 30,000 over asking, 20, 30 offers that you're competing against, escalation clauses, appraisal clauses, and then again, they're asking you to come back with your best and final offer. So
also too, real quick side note, if you guys could mute yourself, I hear background noise from someone. I would appreciate it if you would mute yourself. Thank you. Moving on to section C1, make sure that there's a time with an AM, PM and the appropriate time zone. The contract is written, there's some language in section S that state that it's Hawaii Standard Time. There's nothing wrong with being over diligent about these kind of things. Certainly the AM, PM can throw people off, because we also, being in Hawaii, we deal with a lot of buyers and sellers that might be off island. So put that in there. I oftentimes will see expiration dates. Actually, because templates are being used, I will often see an expiration date that's already since passed. So make sure that you have that correct. C2, when using additional deposit, use language like 2 business days after J1 satisfaction. That's my favorite and my go-to. You can structure this however you want, but I would say that that's probably the most common one. What you don't want to do is have weird abbreviations like 2 biz days. Or 2 days after J1. Here's some reasons for that. If ever you had to go to court and you're sitting in front of either being deposed by an attorney, a judge, or jury, and it's 2 biz days, they're going to question your professionalism, your skill set. You don't want to even go down that path. 2 days after J1, the question that I would have is 2 days what? Like after you sign off on it, 2 days after the J1 expired, if you have it as 10 days, like there's too much ambiguity and you're leaving a window a little bit too far open. So be clear. 2 business days after J1 satisfaction is obviously very, very clear.
And make sure you insert something, right? Because a lot of times it'll say initial deposit X amount, additional deposit X amount, but it doesn't state when you're going to put it in. Yeah. So, be diligent.
D1, if something is not applicable, don't leave it blank. The PC requires you to enter NA in the spaces provided. So I see this happen all the time, this and a few other sections. So let's say that D1, this is, by the way, the other thing to bear in mind is this section is kind of sandwiching, is telling the buyer and the seller what all is included in that purchase contract. So sometimes people will say, oh, I have an ABA or I have another addenda that's not listed on here, but I'm adding to it, then it doesn't count then. It's not part of the purchase contract. You have to make it part of their purchase contract by inserting it into D1 or by changing it later via an amendment. So make sure that you guys know that. So if you're not using a 1031 exchange, you're not using an agreement of sale, you're not using whatever components are listed in D1, just put NA and then put X on the ones that you are to make it real clear and concise as to what documents are being made part of this contract. And we'll go into some other things too, but I just thought of this, and I think we have it listed at the end, but it's worthwhile bringing it up one more time is, when we talk about contingencies, 2 days after J1 satisfaction, if you're doing your own transactions, which you probably shouldn't, you probably can get more use if you hire a transaction manager, transaction coordinator. But if you're using a TM, and let's say that J1 comes about and it's a clean property for the most part, and there's only there's a 10-day J1, you do the inspection in 2 days, find out that there's really not much anything wrong with the property. So in 2 days, you have the buyer sign the J1. Should I send it in? Because he's happy with it. He said, no, we're good. No. I love it. Why shouldn't I do that?
It's not just about J1 with the home inspection. If you take a look at J1 in the terms of the contract, it states that, aside from the home inspection itself, that you have to approve all of the documents or all of the items that are listed in general disclosures of section I, which is building permit disclosure, asbestos disclosure, hazardous waste and toxic substances disclosure, wastewater, mold, sex offender registry, flood zone, lead-based paint, climate changes, wired funds, and so on and so forth. So if something comes up within the 10 days that are outside of the J1 home inspection, but something comes up in section I, it's too late already. You already blew by it. And here's the other thing too. I see a lot of contracts coming in with 5 days, 7 days home inspections. If you do your home inspection on day 2, 3, or 4, even though it's within that time frame, if there's a major issue that comes up, you don't have enough time to address it. You don't have enough time to get an electrician in there, a plumber, a roofer, an AC guy, or a pool person. So please stop shortchanging your buyers and put 15 days in there. It doesn't really matter, what the seller wants. They can always go ahead and counter it, but give your buyers extra room, to deal with some of these issues. You're playing with a lot of their money. And I know for me, like if I'm buying something, I'm not going 4 or 5 days. It's always 15 days because I've seen it happen too many times where you get the inspection and you don't have enough time to do other inspections, and then you got to either accept it or you got to walk from it. So tip, if you're competing with other offers, I've used this many, many times, and this works. You got to understand the market. You got to understand the offers that are coming into a specific property. But if you're competing with other offers and there are other offers coming in, but the buyer might be maxed out, maybe it's a VA loan, maybe it's an FHA loan, something like that. Consider writing an offer at $1,000 over asking or $2,000 over asking. That way, the listing agent must state that they have offers in hand, but above asking. I've done this before with success. Doesn't work every single time, but it's just a little tip or trick that you can use to your benefit. It kind of, for the most part, it scares other potential buyers or offers from coming in. And this is, again, assuming that the listing agent is an ethical listing agent and not saying, because I'm sure you've all heard this, hey, do you have any offers in hand? Oh yeah, I have one at $432,500. So if you make an offer more than that, you've got it. That's not okay to do that. So this is assuming that you have ethical agents on the other side of that. E2, moving on. Oh, hold on, let me just make sure I don't have any questions in the chat here. Mitzi, I'll call you later. That's a trickier question. Look at Attilio helping us out. Thanks, Attilio. E2, if something's not applicable, don't leave it blank. I keep saying this because I'm telling you, I keep seeing it over and over again. It says it right in the instructions. Write NA if not applicable. This is per the contract. The PC requires you to enter NA in space provided. Make sure all items checked are in fact there
or obviously not there if you're putting NA. It creates a conflict. If you put on there that there's a dishwasher and there's no dishwasher, or vice versa, it causes a problem in escrow. And you know, when buyers are looking at property before they even make an offer, they're putting their best foot forward. So are the sellers. It's kind of like they're dating. Once they're in escrow, things can get a little contentious. And suddenly it's like someone thinks that the other side might be taking advantage or screwing them. I mean, we don't want to present that issue, and you want to have as smooth the transaction as possible. The other thing too is if you represent a seller, I've had this happen before early on, is make sure that you let your sellers know that whatever's in the property at the time of the home inspection has to remain in there. If they in fact plan on having that conveyed, it says that in the listing agreement, whatever appliances are in there at the time of the home inspection are to be conveyed. Otherwise, the buyer has an issue, has a potential claim. I've had that once before where I had sellers that I went through everything and the seller said, yes, the washer and dryer are going to convey, and that this is the washer and dryer. For whatever reason, at the last minute, they decided, oh no, we want to take them with, and it was gone. And it was there during the home inspection, and it wasn't there during the final walkthrough. So guess what? That was a washer and dryer mistake that I had to pay for, that I learned from. So make sure that you know that. E3. So E3.
Let me go back to E2.
Yep.
You know, in reviewing contracts, you know, I look at every contract as a lawsuit, just kind of waiting to happen. And one of the things that we require is that you send us the MLS printout with all the photos. If you're writing an offer on a contract and there's a PV system that's in a photo and it's not included in your E2, it's like, I mean, I don't think the seller is going to go ahead and take the PV system because as attached, you know, stays attached. But what does it look like to the seller's agent on the other side of the transaction when you make mistakes like that? You know, as small or minute as you think they are, they're big when you're competing against other agents that are a little bit more diligent, you know, in the way they write contracts. So just kind of keep that in mind.
And by the way, too, I've had my offer accepted out of assuming that all things are kind of fairly equal, because my contract was super clean. Because if you're a listing agent, wouldn't you want to work with an agent that's professional?
Absolutely.
You don't want to deal with one that you're like, oh my God, if I counter, I got to have 16 things that I got to counter on. And some of it is typos, or some of it is like is clear things that they should have included that they didn't include, or whatever the case is.
So sometimes it comes down to that, you know, who's the agent on the other side of the transaction? You know, and a seller, you know, a seller may say, well, you know, this is $5,000 more. And the agent was like, okay, I know it's $5,000 more, but I can tell you that the agent's going to be a problem. As with this guy, he's more professional. I've worked with him before. We won't have any problems getting to closing. And sometimes it comes down to that. So, you know, your reputation is really important.
So a couple of questions that came through regarding E2, which I think are important to note is, one is, even though you list the washer and dryer in an exclusion, do you need to remove them at the time of the inspection? The answer is no. If you're excluding it in the MLS on the listing documents, is only one half of it. The other and most important thing is to make sure that it's excluded on the purchase contract. If it's excluded on the purchase contract and it's still physically there, that's fine. I would, for clarity's sake, make sure that all parties know. But you're going to have a conflict if it's excluded on the listing document, but it's included on the purchase contract. That's a problem. What if the appliances are broken, seller knows and will disclose? Can we mark NA and abandon in place? My feeling is on it is it also depends on the purchase contract, on how make sure the SRPDS disclose that, and then make sure that if you intend on leaving it behind, because removal from items from the property could get a little tricky as well. But what's your thoughts on that question?
The washer dryer?
If the appliances are broken, seller knows it, discloses it, can we mark NA and abandon it in place? I think it's got to be in section Q.
Yeah, section Q.
Okay, so moving to E3. E3, inclusions of photovoltaic system and or security system contracts or leases. It's my opinion, and I want to make this a standard in KW, is oftentimes people look at that as, for the PV, if it's a leased system. Don't look at it like that. That's obviously a lease system. It clearly states that leased PV system, leased alarm system, energy purchase PV agreement, or other. If it's an owned system, it should be indicated as an owned system in E2, as well as check E3. And the reason is because there are some owned systems that are truly owned systems that might have either an annual maintenance agreement or some annual contractual thing, even if it's not a monetary thing. It's they have to opt in for some certain documents or whatever the case is. Check E3 to ensure that you get all of the, whatever the owner has from a PB document perspective or contract perspective, you want it. And the only way you're going to get it is if you check E3 and require or request that they include it.
Yeah, and you also want additional time to, especially like a net meeting agreement with HECO, you want to make sure to have one in place.
One suggestion, which I thought was great, is during inspection, get serial numbers of the appliances to avoid switching out of lesser valued items. If you have a good inspector, the inspector will also note the brand, the serial number as well, and they'll take photos of it. But yes, whatever is there during the time of the inspection is really important. Moving to F2. F2, you should have whatever days, like 45 days from acceptance, and delivered vacant. That was something that Tony had brought up. That was recommended, I think, by an attorney friend of yours, which I think is brilliant, and delivered vacant, assuming that it's supposed to be delivered vacant.
Because F2 is really only covers legal title possession, doesn't include physical possession. I want to go back to E4 for a minute. If you're selling a property that has furnishings in it, get an inventory list and also take photos. The last thing you want to see is like have a different couch that your client was hoping for, or a table and chairs, and that's not what's there. So just, especially if you're dealing with, back in the days when we were dealing properties in Waikiki with vacation rentals, and it came with knives, spoons, forks, everything. Just lay them out on the counter. It's like, hey, 7 spoons, 8 spoons, 9 spoons, just go off just pictures worth 1,000 words.
F3, before completing, check with the buyer's lender. This is the one-time unilateral right to extend. This is different, by the way, from the previous iteration of that too. Before it was a bilateral right to extend, now it's unilateral. But this is a double-edged sword, so make sure that you understand what that is and what that means. Is sometimes people just throw in a number of days, and I don't know if you guys are looking at that properly, but what's common, 7 days, 10 days, 14 days is kind of what's common. Anything shorter or longer, not to say that that's wrong. This is not a right or wrong thing. Again, it has to adhere to the buyer's goals and priorities, but know what that means, that either side can use it. That's what unilateral means. So if you have 10 days in there and you're the buyer and you're let's say that you do a lock extension and it's cost them X amount of dollars and they know that and they were willing to pay that, and you're down to the wire, basically. I'm sure all of us have been there before, where there's not a whole lot of wiggle room, and you go to extend, or somebody, or the sell side says, we need to extend the closing. That really might screw up the buyer in terms of a lock extension. Who's going to pay that $2,000 or $3,000 lock extension fee? So it can be used on either side. To reverse back to the other firm's addenda, I've seen this before. I forgot which firms, it doesn't matter which firm, but I've seen this before. I'm sure you have as well, where they use language like, for instance, if it's a 10-day extension, if either party uses a portion of that, the remaining portion is still in effect to be used by either party.
Right.
So if, in other words, if you have a 10-day in F3, if you use 3 days, there's 7 days that are still remaining on that. So again, as I mentioned, the purchase contract, if you know how to use it and if you're savvy about it, it really is like a chess match in some sense. I've done this before too. If I'm dealing with, again, who you're dealing with on the other side is really, really important. Who that other agent is. We all have experiences, both good and bad, with other agents. I've used this to my advantage before, where I know I don't have the money or time. The buyers don't have the ability to extend and pay another lock extension fee. And we're right up to the wire. I have literally use this, like let's say I had a 10 days in F3A. I've extended it by 1 day for the sole purpose of burning that, so that no one else can use that they don't pop that on me later. But that's assuming that the buyer's already signed, that you already have final loan approval, or the funds are on target to be wired, but you burn that now so that the other side can't use it against you as well. But you want to be careful and cautious. If you're doing that, call your BIC. To help strategize. F4, if you aren't competing with another offer, please use First Hawaii Title as a title and escrow company. They are one of our premier partners, and they do a great job in helping to support us. E4, I don't know why it's out of order, but E4, that to Tony's point, if you are including that, make sure you include an inventory list and photos. F8, on the buy side, if you're writing a contract for a buyer, you're going to want to select seller on both F8A and F8B, and you're going to want to write none in each of the blanks. But, you know, like attorneys, right, real estate agents will give contrary advice depending on who they're representing and their best interests. So likewise, if you're on the list side, if you know there is going to be an assessment that the seller is currently making payments on, you may want to consider countering and having this prorated. But make sure that you inform the other agent as to what that assessment is, as well as have the seller disclose it as such in the SRPDS, the seller disclosure. So if there's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you know, there's been cases where there's an assessment or the association will take out a loan and everybody's responsible for a certain amount of money towards the loan. It's still an assessment. It's in addition to, you know, maybe rolled into the maintenance fees, but they're going to, you know, change the maintenance fees when the loan is paid off. And we've had cases where sellers have said, oh, no, it's not an assessment, it's a loan.
You know why too is because I remember this one. It's good to point out is the HOA documents that came through said this is not an assessment or categorized as this is a loan. So because another party, in this case the association, is calling it something different, it doesn't mean that it's not part of what this means here, which is an assessment.
So you want to make sure that you review the documents. You know, when you get the condo docs, take a look at, you know, the RO105C, the meeting minutes, the financial statements. See that there's a loan or an additional loan. Do they have enough reserves? Is there another loan that's going to come up? Because they may not deem an assessment, but they're going to take out a loan for $5 million and everybody's going to be, you know, have their maintenance fees increased by $250 a month for the next 20 years. Those are things that you have to look for, because this one, the particular case that I'm talking about, it came down to the wire and it was argued, you know, after the fact, and the buyer just ended up having to eat the additional cost, which is not a good thing. I'm not sure if you're going to get referrals from that buyer if you're the agent on the other side, because you don't do your due diligence.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, listing side. If there are any known assessments, make sure that you address it in section Q. F12, keys of the property. You'll notice this is a new change too. You only get one set of keys. So if the buyer wants to have 2 sets of keys, 2 fobs, 2 garage door openers, whatever it is, make sure that you include it in E2, which is the inclusions.
Can I go back to F10?
Yeah.
Okay, so F10 is, you know, once buyer takes possession of the property, they assume all liability, all risk. Whichever occurs sooner, take possession or closing. So, you know, right now there's an issue with having termite tenting done prior to closing because a couple of companies, they're out of business now. So getting a termite treatment is usually taking 30 days after the current closing day. So just make sure that if you're trying to get your buyer or the seller is trying to get your buyer to close and accept termite treatment 30 days down the road, if the termite company causes any damage to the property, it's the buyer's responsibility. So if you're representing the buyer, just tell them that you want to extend.
And by the way, that's not uncommon for a termite company to cause some damage. And usually where they cause damage is eaves, rain gutters, some components.
Only tile roofs, you know, a bunch of cracked tiles. It becomes the buyer's issue. So, you know, represent your buyer thoroughly. And, you know, in that situation, you know, maybe you want to get a termite inspection done way ahead of time to avoid that if you're on the sales side.
And, you know, one thing to go back to is Tony had mentioned about the HOA and minutes and so forth. There's a whole class that we can teach solely on how to look at condo docs and association documents and so forth. But the one thing about minutes that I think is often overlooked by newer agents versus more experienced agents is the minutes really do allow you to be kind of a fly on the wall with the board of directors of that association to see what the common complaints are. Or do they have a lot of break-ins? Do they have a lot of noise? Is there a couple of neighbors that are difficult? Or more importantly, do they keep talking about the same upgrades or maintenance issues month after month after month? you know that something is going to change. Like there's going to be, if it's not already in the plan for in the budget, there's going to be something that's big that's coming. So if that's part of that tool, that you're going to use that in conjunction with what the budget and the finances are. But the minutes are really important and should not be overlooked. Okay, H1. And hey guys, we'll take a couple of breaks, like a 5-minute break here and there. So, you guys can stretch your legs a little bit and so forth. H1, let me jump over there real quick. Buy side, make sure you are entering the type of proof of funds, such as POF, which stands for proof of funds, from buyer's lender, or submit using NA for H1A. This is important because, and again, Tony and I were just talking about this and strategizing for this class on how and when to use certain things. Here's my 2 cents on some of this. Is if you represent a buyer, and let's just say it's a conventional loan, right? There's a 20% down payment or whatever it is. You don't want to write this offer and check bank statement, and you don't want to necessarily check verification of depository from a financial institution. Here's the reasons why. Is if you're helping your buyer negotiate the best deal, you in many cases can be providing too much information, which might hinder or ruin your negotiation. And what I mean by that is, what if you aren't making an offer at asking? What if you're making an offer less than, and you have a bank statement that shows a ton of money in it, or a verification from the bank showing a ton of money in it? That doesn't necessarily help your case. Or it could work in reverse too. You're making an offer on a property that's 1.2 million, and the bank statement shows just enough, like just enough. That's not necessarily helpful either. So by choosing proof of funds from buyer's lender, what the buyer's lender will say is, we've reviewed John Smith's assets and they have enough to satisfy this loan. And that's enough, because they're not saying an amount. They're just saying that's satisfactory, right? For at least for the lender's concern. So that's what I would choose if the buyer has some sort of financing that he's doing. Now, how do you then structure it if it's an all cash deal? Well, then there's no lender involved, right? So you will have to then go back to either a bank statement, which I'm not a fan of. And if you do, by the way, send over any bank statements, you're going to probably want to redact some of the personal information, like the account numbers and so forth. But I would probably lean towards, if it were an all cash deal, and I would love your opinion, is the verification from depository. But if it's typically, they have that much money in the bank and it's all cash, they probably have a personal banker. And that personal banker can kind of customize that a little bit so they're not giving away too much information. Right. Similar to the proof of funds letter. Is that your experience too?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. One other thing on, because we had an issue with this, on no contingency on obtaining cash funds. You check A, verification of cash funds, and you fill in all the blanks for the number of days. Consider deleting the line that says, if seller is not satisfied with such evidence of cash funds, seller can elect to terminate the purchase contract. And the reason being is that if they don't like it for whatever reason, you could be a penny short, you could be $1 over, they can go ahead and cancel. And the case that we had was, we were in escrow representing the buyer, and the transaction manager, if you're writing an offer for $1 million and your verification of cash funds is from the lender and it's an $800,000 loan, and all of a sudden they say, okay, well, he's got $200,000 in the bank and I verified that and it's an $800,000 mortgage, they counter at 1.1, and now you've got to come up with additional funds. Get the additional funds and the pre-qualification or pre-approval letter and attach it with the counter offer to go in. Don't wait until the offer is already accepted to go ahead and send it in. And the reason being is that a TM had done that, and the sellers had a backup offer that had come in that was substantially higher.
And it reset that right from the seller.
And it reset the clause. And so what ended up happening is that they tried to cancel on the first buyer, go into second position with the other buyer, and then they realized that they made a mistake and try to cancel on the second buyer, who the buyer was kind of like, hey, I flew all the way here from California. I'm going to sue you on principle. And it got into this kind of, it got into litigation, and ended up costing the seller money to buy out the first buyer so that they can convey property to the second buyer. So if you got a TM, they shouldn't be doing anything unless it's at your direction.
Even our in-house TM, just make sure you're in charge. You make sure that you're, as a licensee, giving them direction.
And that's why I said delete that, because even if you send it in and they don't have the option to cancel, you're in the clear. So it doesn't reset anything.
So what does Tony mean by deleting it? There's a couple of things that you can do. You can either do a strike through, that's allowed, or you can still have an X by H1 but have an NA
Verification.
H1A. Yeah. Now, again, how one side you can do one thing on the buy side, do something entirely opposite on the list side is. If I'm on the buy side, I hate that clause, but a lot of other agents I notice don't really realize that if seller's not satisfied, because there's no test to that. Like Tony was saying, It's so ambiguous. I hate that. It makes me uneasy on the buy side. On the list side, I love that, right? Because now you're on the other side of that. Now you, like to Tony's point, it can be a lender, or they could have their money in a bank that you don't like, and you can go, nah, we don't like that for whatever reason. So make sure that you know and understand that. However, when you're on the list side and you're getting an offer that comes in, assuming that you have a little bit more control over this, you can then counter back and say, I don't want your proof of funds letter, for the exact opposite reasons of what I was speaking to before. When you're on the buy side, you can then go, no, I want to see the bank statement. Show me the bank statement. I want to see the verification from depository. So you can ask for these kind of things when you're on the list side. And why would you do that? Because if you're representing the seller, you might want to know the financial strength of that buyer. So you're trying to open up a little bit more information.
And you can still make a H1A, NA, and still provide them with a bank statement. It's just that the seller doesn't have the right to cancel if they don't like it.
That's right. Yeah. So on here, and again, I think this is not the whole purchase contract and how we use it is not necessarily a right or wrong thing. I mean, there's certain things that are absolutely wrong, but it's not a right or wrong thing because each firm interprets it a little bit differently. And I think it's, with good intention, but there's some poor implementation on this. One of which is what I allude to on the bottom here, which it says choose paragraph H1 or paragraph H2. But for us, there are instances, although albeit minor and few and far between, there are instances where you might use both. Mm-hmm. So Tony, what would be an example of why somebody would use both H1 and H2?
If you've got somebody that has, say, initial deposit and additional deposit in their bank account, but the rest of the down payment is coming from an equity line of credit, you'd kind of have to use two. Otherwise, you're assuming that both the initial and the additional deposit is coming from the equity line of credit as well, right? So that would be one instance that you use both.
Or maybe contingent upon selling another property for the remaining funds. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. So if you use both H1 and H2, what you've kind of done is created an additional contingency at protection for your buyer as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. Guys, we've been about an hour. Let's take a few minutes of a quick break. And then I can also look at the chat to answer some questions as well for you too.
And going back on H2 before the break, if you take a look at it, it just states, and this is a perfect example where you would probably use both. It says, buyer shall provide evidence that is satisfactory to seller of buyer's ability to obtain the balance of the down payment, which is not the initial deposit or the additional deposit.
Yeah, good point. Guys, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. Ask questions, any ahas, you can throw them in the chat. I'll try to get to them as well. All right, so some of you guys have some great questions we just want to address. Some of them will call you because it's the things that are very, very specific to your scenario or not widely used. There's just so many. I'm getting text messages from some of you guys and private messages as well as the group messages. So we'll go off of the ones that are kind of relevant that I think everyone can learn from. The other ones I'll address privately or personally. But one question that came through is when to use, we were talking about the extensions on F3A, but we kind of glossed right over F3B, which is time is of the essence. So personally, it can be used few and far between, but there's absolutely a very specific kind of situation that it should be used for. So we're not saying not to. So what's the situation that someone might want to use that for?
I had that happen where the seller needed to close by a certain day for tax implications, which happened to be like December 31st had fallen on a Wednesday or something like that. And so if it did not close, he did not want to sell. So there was no way he was allowing any buyer to go ahead and extend beyond that day. Or if you've got someone that has done a reverse exchange where they bought something already and now they have to close by a certain day in order for the exchange to go through, that's another reason why, you wouldn't do extend, time is of the essence.
So hopefully that makes sense. The other question that I thought was a great question is, if you represent the buyer, are you recommending that H1A, that sentence, the second sentence, be crossed off entirely? I don't think that we're giving you kind of the tools so you can strike that, and doing so will disallow the seller to cancel based upon their dissatisfaction with whatever document that you're sending over to them. But some of it is also strategy too. So again, going back to the buyer's goals and priorities and the strategy and how many offers are in hand, that's going to come into play. So for instance, if we're competing and we know that there's 17 offers in hand by the seller, you're probably not going to get away with modifying the purchase contract. You know what I mean? So we don't necessarily want you or suggest that you do that if you're also trying to compete too. So it's not if we were to say do only this, then we are doing what we're telling you not to do, which is creating that template. This is a tool. Know what all of that means. Know how it can be a double-edged sword. But in certain cases, you might want to do that. I mean, I've written contracts where I just have, it's as simple as having H1 checked and then the verification portion, that H1A, just be NA. That in fact will just remove that entire paragraph, or you can do a strike through.
And just include a bank statement, because you've included it, they have the proof of funds, it's just that they can't cancel on you if they don't like it.
Right.
Because the last thing you want to do is to get into escrow and to have them say, and you put a long time frame too, right? So that's the reason why on some of these time frames, you've got to be really, really tight, because you don't want to have a seller come back and say, oh, you know what? I just got to review your verification of cash funds. We're already 7 days into escrow, and I decided that I don't like it. So we're going to go ahead and cancel.
All right, let me get back to the slides here. Give me a quick second. I don't know why this thing keeps pinning on Jerry. Jerry, are you muted?
Jerry, are you there?
Make sure you're muted, sir.
I am unmuted. I'm muting it back again. Thanks.
Jerry, we're not picking on you in any.
No, we love you, Jerry. Okay, so getting back to the next slide here on I1B. Let me go and find that I1B here. Actually, I don't know why I didn't even mention it on I1A. Is that not? I skipped that by accident. Okay, so on I1B. I1B is the seller disclosure. So on the buy side, you're going to want this date to be as reasonably short as possible. Ideally, you're going to want to receive the SRPDS so that you can review it and forward it to your home inspector before the home inspection. So what do I mean by that in that chronological order? Is I'll often see people send in offers for me to review, and it'll say, 7 days or even 10 days, because that's the default there, 10 days. What that's doing is when you open up escrow, that's allowing the seller to, up to 7 days or 10 days or whatever that time frame is, to forward you over the seller disclosure. In a perfect world, hopefully it's already done. I mean, when I take a listing, I already have that seller complete the SRPDS already prior to going on the MLS. But you want to have it in time so you can review it. You can ask any questions that you might need to. For instance, if it says roof repaired, sometimes people are kind of vague, right? So on the SRPDS, if it said seller repaired roof or replaced roof 2 years ago, and that's all it said, what's a good question that you could ask the other side is, do you have the receipts? Or does it have a warranty? Did you come, who did it? So you're going to want to have a little bit of dialogue.
Are they licensed?
Are they licensed? So you're going to want to have a little bit of dialogue with the listing agent as a result of receiving that SRPDS, and then kind of highlight or circle certain areas that might be a potential concern and forward it to the home inspector prior to doing the home inspection. So I say that to say that if you have J1 at 10 days and you have I1B at 10 days, that math doesn't work. right? So you want to try to make it as reasonably short as possible. For my agents that I review contracts for, I always tell them to make it 2 days, maybe 3 at most. Could they counter back and change it? Of course they can, but write the offer to put your buyer in the best position to succeed, and then kind of let the counter work itself out. On the list side, it's recommended that you have the seller complete the SRPDS prior to even listing it. This will uncover any potential issues, concerns, litigation, assessments, etc., that you'll need to remedy. Don't wait to solve a problem while in escrow. Also, this is what I do, make the SRPDS available on the supplemental documents on the MLS, as well as at open houses. And I've gotten this question asked many times is, hey, if I give them the SRPDS, what if they don't make an offer? If they're going to cancel as a result of what's on the SRPDS, I would rather they not make an offer altogether, right? Because now you're in escrow, then you're back on the market again, and to the public that looks like, well, what's wrong with the property? What happened? And it might not be anything that necessarily happened, but you kind of are providing information a little bit late. So that's my 2 cents on that. Anything else you want to add on that?
The SRPDS?
On I-1?
No, not on I-1.
I-2 is similar. I-2 is the amended disclosure. Same thing, in my opinion, as I-1A or I-1B is 2 or 3 days. That's the amount of days that should be in there. So the reason is if there's an amended disclosure that the seller is aware of or knows of or whatever the case is, you as a buyer representing the buyer, you don't want to have them have, another example is 10 days or 7 days to be able to provide you an updated disclosure. You don't want that to happen, especially if you're at the tail end of your escrow. That might be too long. That might put it past, could you cancel as a result of the receipt of the new amended disclosure? Yes, but that puts you outside of your timeline. So you want it as soon as possible. So on the list side, however.
And we're not talking about, we're not talking about an amended disclosure where the seller, where you've done your home inspection and you say, hey, these are the items that are wrong, go ahead and amend your disclosure. We're talking about something that happens that is not on the home inspection. It takes place after the home inspection, but is definitely something that needs to be disclosed.
Yeah. And then the list side, so I kind of framed it, my example on the buy side. On the list side, you'll want this as long as possible, so you can have a potential remedy by the time you find this issue out. And the example I've given is the AC isn't working, which obviously you must update the SRPDS. However, you can say it's already been serviced by the AC company last Monday or last Wednesday or whatever the time frame is. So you're providing the updated SRPDS, but you may in fact be providing the solution for it as well. So again, contrary advice depending on what side you're on, the buy side or the list side. I-3A pertains to the receipt of the SRPDS. This is not, to me, a huge factor. This is just signing the receipt. You're not satisfying it or signing off on it. You're just acknowledging the receipt of it. I-3B pertains to the time to examine the SRPDS, which is really important. Again, this gives your buyer the ability and time frame, which is really, when I say buyer, it's certainly the buyer, but it's really you as well. The time to look everything over and ask questions or get receipts or verify certain things, especially in an older home or an SRPDS that's extremely lengthy in its content. I-3C pertains to the time to examine an amended SRPDS. So same thing to examine, but now you're examining the amended that had been amended to Tony's point, amended by the seller. So a tip on the buy side, right for I-3C, with 15 days for the benefit of the buyer. So the longer that time frame is for both I-3B and I-3C is better. Now, would the other side allow for that? Depends on the other agent. If a savvy agent on the list side is probably going to counter that out. But again, you want to write it to the benefit.
Well, they may not catch it. And perfect examples of what Chad said. Okay, you get a call from the seller and they say, okay, well, the AC went out, but we went ahead and we serviced it. Okay, well, they serviced it and it works, but maybe it's not blowing air at 76 degrees or below. Maybe it's like at 80 degrees. Maybe your buyer wants a house that's at 68 degrees all the time. So just because it has been serviced doesn't mean it works to your buyer's liking. So therefore, you've got 15 days to have your own inspector go out and say, okay, well, what is the servicing? What was the servicing done? And what's the effect of it? Is it still working? Is it still cooling the house? And we've seen cases that's not the case, right? Where it's okay, it works, but it's not blowing anything less than 76 degrees, which I don't know about you, but if I got an air conditioner, I want to be in, 72 or 69.
Otherwise, it's just a fan.
It's just a fan, right? And so the longer the better, because you just don't want to cut your client short and say, okay, well, here's the disclosure statement. You got 2 days to do it. So it's not enough time. And there's a reason why they put in 15 days, because 15 days is kind of like how you can go back and forth and get inspections done and find out how much is this going to cost, and go back and you can negotiate stuff. Because once you pass the timeline, it's too late for your buyer.
The other thing too is, to that point, is when you're on the buy side and you're negotiating some of these things to be repaired, it's always advisable when you make that request, whether it's a plumber, electrician, an AC guy, get someone who's licensed, a licensed contractor who's licensed to do that work, because then you come down to at least a professional's opinion as to if this is in working order to the specs that is recommended by that industry, versus, the seller did it himself, or a handyman or a friend across the street. I mean, you want to take it seriously. Tip, I3 is seller driven, while I4 is buyer driven. So just know the differences between the two. The languages, again, I think it's with great intention, but poorly executed. This contract has some flaws, and some of the language can be a little confusing. So on the buy side, if you use 15 days, you'll have an additional 15 days to terminate the purchase contract upon discovery or amended disclosure. On the list side, you're going to want a minimum amount of days in I4B. To avoid such an extended time frame, the buyer can cancel, attend the home inspection so you know what the pertinent issues are, and if it's not on the SRPDS, immediately add it and have it redisclosed. I'll give you an example. This is a realistic example. Is when this contract first came out, I want to say it was like within a couple of weeks, I was in escrow on a listing on a property, and I attended the home inspection. So the seller was extremely detailed and diligent, and detailed almost everything. Like, I don't know that anything was missed, but as you guys know, there's no such thing as a perfect bill of health on a property. So there are always things that will come up on a home inspection that the seller didn't know of, always, because the seller's not crawling around in the attic or underneath the house or whatever, right? They know what they know. In this case, so even though the seller was extremely detailed, I attended the home inspection representing the seller, and not in the way that I'm like in the face of everybody or getting in the way, but I let the home inspector in. I'm friendly. They're business people and they're salespeople too. They want to earn your business as well. So they for the most part, are very professional and cordial. After he's done with his walkthrough and kind of checking things out, before the buyer's agent and before the buyer came, I just said, hey, so, what's going on, and what do you see? Any big issues? And he's kind of giving me the list, which is very normal. This is wrong. That's wrong. This is wrong. Blah, 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 blah. I took note of all those things. And then I hung out when he did the summary with the buyer, but I kept my distance so that not to be, interfering with what they're talking about. But I checked my notes and added any kind of details that I might need to add. And then I sent it over to the seller and said, I found out that these items came about on the home inspection as well. The seller immediately amended and updated their SRPDS that day and resubmitted it to the buyer. And so why would you do that? The reason why you'd want to do that is because if you wait until the buyer requests it, now you're just adding days. Like you're doing it on the tail end. If I took initiative and did it the day after the home inspection, for lack of a better term, I'm closing a window on them that they would otherwise have open for a longer period of time. So again, it's playing chess. It's the strategy of it, and just know that those things are something that you want to make sure that you understand. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes. So you have to really pay particular attention to I3C and I4A, right? Because a lot of times what happens is that what Chad was saying, you do a home inspection, you make the seller aware of it, and they give you an amended disclosure statement, and you wrote down your contract that the buyer has 2 days to review and approve the amended disclosure statement. If you don't notify the seller, then they have 15 days in I4A. So that's why it's really important to know what you're writing in the contract, not to use a template to just, really figure out what your client's wants and needs are. Now, if you're on the seller side and you pick that up and say, oh my God, they've got 15 days after date of discovery, I hope. That's why you call the buyer's agent, hey, what issues came up that we need to be aware of so that we can stay in contract and amend the disclosure statement, right? And you're like on the other side, like, well, I don't have to tell you. I'm going to blow out my whole 15 days, and then I'm going to let you know, and then you can go ahead and do your amended disclosure statement. Because it states also in I-4 that it doesn't negate the seller's obligation to provide an amended disclosure statement. That's like a whole nother, that's a whole nother session with Chemo Stone. So just be diligent and know the contract.
And, also too, to your point of know the contract, absolutely read the contract. I have a feeling that a lot of agents, you guys will call your BICs or your brokers and say, hey, I have a question, section whatever, J1 or I5, how do I interpret this? And I'll go, did you read it? And the answer almost always is no, I didn't read it. So please read it. I mean, we should both be reading it together over the phone or in person when you have a question, because we're absolutely here to help, but don't rely on us to give you answers. We want to teach you how to fish. We don't want to necessarily just do things for you. Tip, general disclosures. Lead-based paint disclosure is required as an added disclosure to all properties built 1978 or earlier. Failure to do so is a $10,000 fine by the EPA per incident, meaning that if 3 initials or signatures are missing, that's $30,000. One of the things that I do is you can Google this. It comes up immediately on the EPA site, but I think it's protecting your family from lead-based paint. I think is what it's called, the brochure or EPA brochure. You can download it as a PDF, and when I send out the purchase contract to a buyer, I include that PDF. I think it's like 20-something pages long, but I include it in there, and I have them sign an initial that they've received that document along with the lead-based paint disclosure. That way, if it ever came up, it's taken care of.
And then also, if you're representing the seller on the listing side, just include it, include it in supplemental documents.
Yeah, absolutely. J1, if the property is old, this is kind of going back to what Tony had mentioned before too, but if the property is older or larger or kind of a unique type of property, maybe where it's located on a hill or in certain areas or whatever, leave enough time to conduct all the necessary inspections. So just as a rule of thumb, anything that's older than a certain amount of years, I would say anything that's older than like maybe 35, 40 years old, you should absolutely be doing not only a general inspection with hopefully a very good and reputable home inspector, but you should be doing a sewer scope. There are some instances where you might want to have an electrician or a plumber come, and that could be by way of your visual inspection. When you went to go look at the property, there might be some staining on the ceiling or some wet stains behind the washer or dryer. Those are kind of indications that you might need to get someone else involved as well. PV on the roof, you can have a PV inspector. If there's an AC, you can have the AC inspected as well. The other thing too is the reason why you want to have your J1 home inspection done as soon as possible is because if the findings come out that you need another inspection as recommended by the home inspector, you need to have room to do that. So if you have a 10-day J1 and you're doing your home inspection on day 9, that's way too late. What you should be doing is getting ahead of it. So the way that I would do it typically is if I know that I've written an offer on a couple of properties, I've submitted the offer, I know that we're probably going to be accepted because I'm talking to that other agent. We're going back and forth on just some minor details, but 90%, 95% chance that they're going to accept my offer. I'm already texting and emailing my home inspector and asking him to block out a certain time frame that's coming up, because the good home inspectors are going to be blocked out for a while, right? So I'm already ahead of it. And if I don't get that, I'll just let them know that to cancel it, and it's no big deal. But if I do, I'm doing the home inspection usually on day 1 or 2 of escrow. And the reason simply is exactly that. I have a lot of time to do other inspections if necessary, or as a result of their findings. So that's super, super important.
And also, if you're selling properties that are in the upper range and they have PV and they have AC, especially and they have a pool, tell the buyers like, hey, aside from your just regular home inspection, you need a pool inspector, you need a PV inspector, you need all these guys, right? Just imagine going to a restaurant and everybody's in the kitchen. You got one guy that makes baked goods. You got one guy that makes salad. Well, the salad guy is really good at making salad, but he's not really good at making, desserts. And so while a home inspector can catch all these little items just based on a visual inspection, the guy that's really going to know about the AC is a professional AC guy. The guy that's going to know about the roof is a roofing person. Same thing with the pool person, right? You want professionals in all fields inspecting that equipment for you.
And here's something that's kind of interesting bad, I guess, about Hawaii, unlike some other states, is there's no special license to be a home inspector. Can you imagine that? Like, tomorrow I could be a home inspector with just creating that business. So you want to make sure that who you're using as a home inspector, or who you're recommending that the buyer use, is someone that's reputable, that's a professional, that's highly recommended by your peers and what have you. And we have a list we can provide to you of a handful of people that we use, but that's really, really important. You don't want to use a fly-by-night company, or certainly a new company, or someone that kind of does it part-time. You want somebody that knows what they're doing. To avoid confusion, chronologically calculate your J3, J8, and J9. So J3 is the final walkthrough. J8, removal of items from the property, and then cleaning is J9. So the reason why I say this is because you, the agent we're talking to right now that's on this Zoom call, you guys might be super diligent, super detailed, and would never mistake in any of these kind of things. But assuming then that the other side that you're negotiating with, that you're in escrow with, they're using a TC or a TM, and that person is typically just putting dates into a calculator, into a timeline rather, and just running off of that. And if they got 30 different escrows that TC is doing, they're not necessarily thinking that, oh, this is going to run into the same day. So if you have the removal of items, cleaning, and the final walkthrough on the same exact day, I've literally done this so many times where I'll call and I go, hey, we're going to do the final walkthrough, and we need an extension on that because we're still getting it clean. Like, set yourself up for success and just assume that the other side does not know what they're doing, and make it chronological. Removal from items from property, 7 days, cleaning in 6 days. Therefore, it'll be done, ready, and kind of presentable in 5 days. Tony made the standard a number of months back, 6-7 months back or whatever, to have J3 be a minimum of 4 days. I think that you were talking, and you and I were talking about it just yesterday, that you might want to change that to 5 days.
Yeah, especially kind of like, in this case, right?
Issues, that's why.
In this case, like you're on a long weekend, you're recording on Tuesday, but you got 4 days. So you do your final walkthrough inspection on Friday. It's too late. Your loan is funded. The documents at the Bureau of Conveyances, like, you can't pull recording. And then I want to go back to one other item with regards to J8, removal of items from property. Like, oh, the property's vacant, it's not needed. Well, it's vacant at the time, and there's nothing in the property at the time. Who's to say that a week before closing that the seller doesn't go in there and decide that he's going to empty out his storage locker and throw everything inside the house, and then you guys close after you've done your inspection already, and you walk in with your clients on date of recordation, now it's full of stuff. Well, you didn't tell me we need to clean anything out, that we didn't remove any junk items. A lot of this stuff is far-fetched, but I look at everything worst case scenario and be prepared for the
Because you know why?
and hope for the best.
The far-fetched ones are the ones that are going to cost you your license. That's the reason why, too. So it is far-fetched, but you want to be, prepared.
Because then your clients look to you. It's like, oh, well, you told me that they didn't have to clean it, or you told me that they didn't have to remove the property. There was no problem with it. And now you're paying a mover, you're paying a cleaner, you're paying for everything else that needs to be done that the seller should have been obligated to do, but you didn't write into the contract. If your people are going to scrape the house and make it dirt, no big deal. But if your clients are looking to move in and you don't have, just because it's clean when you go look at it, doesn't mean it's going to be clean by the time you go to closing.
Yeah. A couple of great questions that came up that I want to answer as well. So are these calendar or business days? Great question. If you refer to section S2 of the contract, dates and times, as used in this purchase contract, the term day means a calendar day. The other thing that's come up before as well is when the acceptance date. So S1 is referring to acceptance date. As used in the purchase contract, the term acceptance date means the date on which the purchase contract becomes binding on all parties. So if to go back to S2, if the contract is being accepted, let's call it, May 1st, the acceptance date is May 2nd, not May 1st. It's not the date that it's executed, it's the following calendar day. So just realize that that's the language that's built into the purchase contract. Who covers the cost for additional inspections such as AC, roofer, plumber on the buyer side? That's
The buyer, all the buyer. And if they're spending $1.2 million, $1.3 million, look, if it's a $200,000 condo, you don't need to get the AC inspected maybe, but if they're spending a bunch of money, people like that, they don't have any problems with spending additional money to protect their investment. But
here's the thing though, too, and I allude to it a little bit later on the slides towards the latter part of this presentation, but you're gonna wanna do always, you're gonna wanna do a buyer consultation. There's a lot of things, a lot of teaching and training and expectations that can be had during a good buyer consultation. And you're going to tell the buyer, this is before even seeing a single home, hey, we're going to see different homes and of different conditions. Some of them might be brand new, built a week ago. Some of them might have been built 70 years ago. In either case, you're going to want to have a home inspection, but we might have additional inspections on a property that might be a little bit older or a little bit more run down or whatever the case is. Then when you get closer to that time frame of doing the actual inspection and then you're making a recommendation, hey, the home inspection guy said that we might need to have the sewer scoped and have the roof checked. Those are two additional things. When you tell the buyer this, and this has happened to me too before, I'll tell a buyer and the buyer will go, oh, I don't want to do that, it's fine. Are you sure? Because the home inspector just suggested it, just made that recommendation to have the sewer scope and also have the roof looked at by a professional as well. No, it's fine. I got some friends who can do that. What should that answer be right after that? Is you should immediately email the buyer, per our conversation, you just gave me the instructions to not have additional inspections done, even though it was recommended by the home inspector. So you're documenting this via email so that if ever down the line it comes back and they go, hey, how come you didn't tell me, or how come you allowed me to pass this contingency without getting it further inspected, you have this proof that you absolutely did tell them that. And a simple email like that can save your license. So make sure that you document that.
So, if you're dealing with an inspection on the older home, maybe you want to choose an inspector that can already scope, that they have the equipment to go ahead and scope the
Some do,
line.
not all,
Some do, not all of them do, which eliminates the extra time to get a plumber out there.
But sewer scoping, for the most part, in my experience, is anywhere between $150 to $250. It's not a huge amount, but I can tell you one thing though. You know what is a huge amount? If one of the pipes need to be replaced and it's under a driveway, God forbid it's a CPR and it's a shared driveway or something like that. I've seen quotes upwards of $30,000. It's an absolute nightmare. So, $250 is.
And in that case, if it's a shared driveway, do you think your neighbor's going to want you to go ahead and bust up his portion of the driveway to take care of your sewer drain? Yeah. Right? Like, that's a whole nother conversation.
Moving on, J4, avoid having any work completed after closing. This box should not be used unless you've already spoken to your broker first. Tip, by J3, which should have a minimum of 5 days prior to closing, all agreed upon repairs should be completed. Why should all the repairs be completed? And what do you do, Tony, if it isn't? I mean, I have a couple of suggestions on what you can creatively do if you don't, but why should all the repairs be done upon closing and not after closing? Because, sometimes that happens, right? Like we'll move in, seller agrees to.
It's too late. Risk goes with the buyer upon occupancy or closing, whichever comes first, right?
You know how many times I've heard in escrow, again, because we're still dating in escrow, things aren't really finalized yet, right? I've heard this many times before where, my client, the seller, says that he'll paint the garage or whatever the thing is that you guys are kind of talking about. First and foremost, make sure everything's in writing, but also you don't want it done after closing, because what's the chances of them actually doing that? Probably slim to none. I have done this to success before, but it depends on the escrow company, and it's not something that you want to use as a regular thing. This is more a strategy that's outside the box, used for certain circumstances. Is I have been able to, and the reason why I've used it is for certain loans, like VA, when there's a large credit to be used for repair on something. With VA, if the lender's already paying the closing costs, you have to use it or lose it, right? So if there's if that veteran is not paying any closing costs whatsoever, but there's a repair that you've negotiated, because this is a realistic example of one of mine, is I represented the buyer. It's a VA loan. They had zero closing costs, but we found out because it's an older home, there was a plumbing, the pipes were all under the home and there's some leaks. So the plumbing would have cost about $20,000 to fix, which is a large amount of money. And the majority of the expense was because it's under the home. So they couldn't send in machines, and it was a whole thing that they had to do by hand under like a 3 foot, 2.5 foot space. So what did we do? We negotiated so the repair wasn't done in time for closing, but what was done, which was okay with the buyer, was we did a withholding of that repair into escrow. So escrow held back the entire amount of the money, and they released it to the plumber upon completion. So it still satisfied the buyer, and it satisfied the buyer's lender. But again, those are things that you're going to want to talk and strategize with your broker first, because it doesn't work in all scenarios, nor do you want to do it in all scenarios. But talk to your BICs. That's what we're here for. Jay,
and then also in today's market, because it's such a heated market, having the agent on the other side is really important. Make sure that they're professional, because we've had time and time again, certain agents, certain companies, they just don't do the right thing. They don't advise their seller of the right thing. And I've seen a number of transactions close where the buyers basically, I'm going to say, got screwed, because the seller didn't do the right thing and the buyers wanted a property anyway, and they just had to eat it, right? So, just the agent on the other side can make or break a deal for you.
For sure, absolutely. J8, entire property, do you check it or don't you check it? Why or why not? Again, having this latest iteration of the purchase contract, as far as I'm aware, and I asked Kimo about this hasn't been tested in terms of, I'm sorry, I put J8 entire property, it should be J9 entire property for the cleaning. It hasn't been tested yet in terms of a lawsuit or by a court or anything like that. This potentially can get a little bit tricky, because entire property means just that, inside, outside, whatever. So be clear on, if you're dealing with the buyer, be clear of what you're looking for. Like if it's a property that the buyer intends or hopes that the gutters are going to be clean, the driveway is going to be power washed, which is outside of the norm, by the way. But if that's what they hope and that's what they want, write it in section Q, rather than just check that box and assume that that's going to happen. Whereas on the list side, when you get something that's submitted to you and that box is checked, I highly recommend that you counter that out or reword the language to say interior of the property professionally clean, not entire property. Because entire property, I mean, the legal definition of that could be the hedges in the yard and
with receipts too, right?
Yeah. I mean, so but again, it hasn't been tested, but you don't, trust me when I say you don't want to be the person to go to court to test it out either. So know that for J9. K1 should not be used. This is commonly used on other islands, specifically the Big Island. On Oahu, always use K2. I've seen this come about before. And so just so we're all clear, staking and surveys, that's really something that you should be using for single family, some CPRs, depending on how that's situated, but not condos or townhomes. I've seen it come through on condo and townhome offers that both K1 and K2 are checked, which is both incorrect. But both should not be used at the same time anyways, even if it's on a single family home. On K2, should be 15 days. It should be 15 days, but there's also some examples that you can give for why it could be a little bit shorter too. I inserted this in here because, again, we try to update what we're discussing with you based upon things that we're seeing or things that have come about. So cleaning, J3, J4, a buyer does not, this is really, really important. So make sure that you guys all understand this, because this has come up a couple of times. A buyer does not have the right to cancel as a result of their dissatisfaction during the final walkthrough. Read that again, right? A buyer does not have the right to cancel as a result of dissatisfaction during the final walkthrough. The buyer does have the right to initiate J4, which is the withholding of up to 150%. By the way, this is not a profit, so it's not 150% as though they're keeping the rest of the 50%. It's just that they can withhold a certain amount and then escrow will release the remaining proceeds back to the seller. The buyer can request a reinspection for repairs but not for cleaning. So just a tidbit, just a hack or a tip. This is just for me, and it doesn't apply always, but for whether you're on the buy side or the list side, especially the buy side, it's not a bad idea to negotiate in lieu of having it cleaned, to negotiate a credit for that amount. So if I'm writing an offer, I might say NA for the cleaning on J9, but I will ask for $600 credit in lieu of the cleaning, so that I can set up the cleaning with a professional company, maybe one that the buyer is asking for or would prefer, but it eliminates that issue from even coming about and all that kind of stuff. But that's on the buy side, but most certainly on the sell side, why even deal with that? That's something that you don't even necessarily have to or want to deal with. But again, it's case by case. It depends on what you want to do and the goals and priorities of your client, be it the buy side or the side. Anything you wanted to add to this issue?
Yeah, with regards to J3, right? Like if you have 5 days prior to closing and the sellers don't get to it until 4 days prior to closing, you've got the right to go in and reinspect for repairs that they agreed to take care of.
Repairs.
Not on cleaning.
Right.
If they don't have the property cleaned 5 days prior to, you submit your statement into escrow, your amended contract, and just say, hey, we'll total 150% of whatever the cleaning fee is going to be.
The other thing too is I've just had this come up on a transaction kind of recently too. Is I represented we represented the sell side. We were supposed to close on a Monday, and the buy side reached out to us literally at 6 in the morning or 6:30 in the morning. Now keep in mind, recordation takes place at 8, typically 8:01. So 2 hours before recordation, we're getting a request for withholding, and the withholding was based upon a misunderstanding of J1. So it was nothing that we agreed to or said that we would do in terms of repair or anything like that at all. But regardless, they wanted to use J4. That's why you want to make sure that you have enough time for J3, 5 days, 4 days minimum, but really you kind of want to back that up to 5 days to the example that Tony had given. And the reason for that is you need time to act. So if you just did the final walkthrough the day before recordation, that's too late. There's no time to make an adjustment. And if we're in the business of pivoting and adjusting to protect our client, you're not giving yourself enough time to do that. So you got to give yourself enough time so that you can ask the lender if there's a loan involved. You can ask the lender to not fund, right, or not record or get involved with escrow. But the day before is just simply not going to cut it. So just make sure that you know that. Okay, let me move some things around here. Sorry, I have a couple of screens up at once. Here's a tip. If you're not competing and in an area where the developer put up fences, so Ocean Point comes to mind, Sea Country, Gentry in Eva Beach, you should still ask for a survey, especially if it's a single family home, as you can remove it later during negotiating J1. I've done this before to success. Again, you don't want to do that if you're competing with other offers. All this is predicated on, it's a case-by-case thing. I'm not telling you what to do in terms of a template scenario. I'm giving you some strategies. But if you're not competing, that other agent might not be as savvy. They might accept it with having that survey. But what I've done is, if the developer, Seiko as a developer, or Gentry, or one of the big, DR Horton, they put up the fence lines themselves, there's almost a zero chance that there's going to be any kind of encroachment or issues in terms of a survey. And if the buyer is okay with that, what I've done for my clients is I'm like, hey, I already know the survey is about $1,000. If something comes up in J1, part of my negotiation is, hey, we'll remove the request for the survey if you give us a credit for $1,000 or you fix this item or whatever the case is. But don't get carried away thinking that you should just add that survey in there to every single one if you intend not to have it, because you could shoot yourself in the foot and they would go, oh, this other guy's asking for a survey, this one's not, I'm going to go with the one that's not. So make sure, again, that you have a good idea of the landscape of what you're competing with. Tip: if a seller asks, this is actually something that comes up quite frequently now, but if a seller asks you to accept a previous survey, be sure to examine the SRPDS and ask them questions such as any fences, walls, who installed them, when was it installed. Make sure that when you're physically on the property that you're looking to see, is there any, does it look like it's been damaged? Is it leaning on one side versus another? There's all these kind of things that have to come into play. And if you are accepting a previous, some people, I've made calls to agents and I'm like, hey, we're going to submit an offer, and they'll say, oh, please accept the survey. It's still valid. It's still good. That, I don't know what that means, but I don't know if you guys know this, but the survey expires the date of that as the date on the survey. That survey expires the date of the survey. So there's no such thing as that survey is still valid or that survey is still good or whatever the case is. What they're really saying is, hey, will you please accept the survey so we don't have to pay for another one? That's really what they're asking. So should you or should you not accept an existing survey? The answer to that, and this is my opinion, and Tony can chime in too, is again, everything is predicated on the buyer's goals and priorities. If that buyer is a stickler and it's an area that's an older area where people are putting up all kinds of walls and fences and you don't have any idea what's going on, you're entering into a kind of a treacherous territory as to what you're going to accept. But regardless, if you do plan on accepting it, if the buyer is okay with accepting an existing survey, you should still have, some people put in there on section Q, buyer to accept seller survey. That's absolutely wrong. That's not enough information. That's not enough protection. You should frame it as the buyer is going to receive the seller's survey within a certain amount of days and have a certain amount of days to examine it. And if not satisfied, still gets them the opportunity to cancel based on, certain sections or provisions of the purchase contract and get their earnest money back. That's how it should be worded. So you're not eliminating the right. You're just using an older document, but still giving them the right to examine it in full. And the other thing that I would always do if you're going to accept an existing survey is make sure that the seller updates the SRPDS with stating that there are that they're unaware of any new walls, fences, or any kind of border, structures that have been erected, modified, fixed, or whatever it is since the date of that previous survey. And the reason why I would have them do that is now it's putting it on record for something that ties into the law, which is the SRPDS's 508D. So there's a 24-month statute of limitations. If they lied on that because they've updated the SRPDS, now that's a civil thing that the seller's now on the hook to the buyer after the fact. So that's my 2 cents. What would you say to accepting a previous?
Even if you have like an old SRPDS that's like maybe not SRPDS, but a survey that's like say 10 years old. And even though there are no walls, there are no fences that have been built since then, technology constantly changes. So maybe that a new survey with the technology will pick up some encroachments that weren't noted 10 years ago just because technology is different. So if you got something that's like, 2 years old, 3 years old, maybe not big of a deal. But if you got a survey that they want you to take from 1995, like I would say no, especially in the older neighborhoods.
There's just basically the more distance that you have from today's date to the date of the survey, every day that passes, certainly every year that passes, you're inherently assuming more risk. So just kind of bear that in mind too.
And then what happens in that situation is that your client goes to sell in 3 to 5 years, and that buyer, they want a new survey. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of encroachments show up that weren't noted in the 1995 or 2005 one. And so now your guys are going to be looking to you like, hey, you sold me the house, you told me to accept the survey. I'm going to hold you liable for this rock wall that I need to move. Yeah.
And some of those things are a huge potential liability. If the subject property, if that subject property is the one that's encroaching on something else, on the neighboring property, and you didn't know it or you didn't ask the right questions or whatever the case is, imagine that they move in and then they get a knock on the door like 3 days later from the neighbor saying, hey, you're encroaching by 3 feet or whatever the case is. That's a major issue, especially what if it's a retaining wall or a big rock wall? That's not cheap. A comment from one of our agents is, I think it's in reference to when I said that the date of expiration on a survey is the date that it's dated. It is the same with the appraisals as well. What are you, married to an appraiser or something? How do you know that? She is married to an appraiser, by the way. But that's true. So appraisals are also expired the day after the date of that. Same thing with TIR, same thing with all those kind of things. People always go, oh, it's still valid, still good. That's not the case. What it is the lenders that are using it will clearly they allow for a little bit of time frame to use that document. But they sometimes will ask, is there any, for specifically for an appraisal, is there any updated information that we should include on here? Is typically the question they'll ask. Or for TIR, you know, the tricky thing with that is termites are nasty. You can have a clean TIR and then 3 weeks later have some sort of infestation. So it's tricky. Okay, moving on. Tip, write in who the buyer selects for TIR in section Q. So this is talking about L2. This eliminates the buyer from having to advise the seller later. Because if you notice on there, there's a date on there that the termite inspection contingency within a certain amount of days that the buyer will notify the seller of who they select. If you make that selection in section Q, that handles that right off the bat. M1, do not delete this section. I haven't seen it recently, but there's a period of time when this contract first came out that I would see people, listing agents, counter, and they would counter with delete section M1. If you guys look on M1, I'm sure you can see my mouse, hopefully you can. There's no little box to the left of M1. Box meaning that you could put either an X or you can put an NA. The reason why is because it's not intended to be removed. It's part of the contract. I had a seller that I represented, and they were part of what we later found out was a defunct association. Mm-hmm. And when making an offer on it, you might easily go, oh, well, this isn't a single family residence, so there's no documents. Yeah, but you don't know. You have no idea what's part of an association or not, or a defunct association. And even though it was defunct, she still had some of the documents where by the way, this seller was an attorney, and that seller was so inclined to provide the buyer with, even though it was defunct, they made sure that they provided the buyer with all those documents from that association. Don't NA it. It's not meant to be NA at all. So don't allow someone to counter that out.
Plus there are covenants, conditions, and restrictions in the deeds, right? You know, a lot of leasehold properties we talked about this before. Cam Schools, Campbell Estate, they all had covenants, conditions, and restrictions in the deeds that run with the land. You know, you sell a property in Kahala, it's a 25-foot setback from the street, not 15, in accordance with, DPP, it's 25, right? So if you got a guy saying, okay, I'm going to build a house and I'm going to put it 15 feet, I'm going to move it up 10 feet so I can have more space, like you can't do that. And so that's why you don't want to cross that stuff out.
For M2, it's advisable to write the offer with electronically formatted documents via email and internet address where the documents are located. What I typically never do is have the CDs or the actual hard copies selected. And Tony, what would be a good reason why we wouldn't have that selected? I'll tell you why.
Tell me why.
Tony's not there yet. The reason is because if you cancel, you're obligated to return it. So if it's a CD or DVD, or if it's the actual stack, I know some lenders, or not some lenders, some associations only have it in those documents. If it is what it is, then that's fine. But ideally, you don't want to have to return something should you cancel it. So choose those two. You can do both of them, but don't do the other ones. Tip, if you represent a seller who is trying to decide whether to sell or rent, this is something that I've done, it's been super helpful, is have escrow put together a net sheet, which by the way, you should all be doing anyways if you're listing a property, and have them include HARPTA or FERPTA, whichever is applicable. And that could typically be very helpful in demonstrating to the seller which they should do. So in other words, and this is something that comes up frequently in just my experience, is I work a lot with military buyers, and when they are set to move out and be relocated, sometimes they'll go, well, I'm not really sure. It's usually their first home too. So they're not very, they don't have a whole lot of experience in renting or being investors or anything like that. So I may have in fact even helped them purchase their first home. So they're looking to sell. They've only owned it and occupied that for 2 or even 3 years, for instance. And they're going, we're trying to decide whether we want to sell it or rent it. Those are two entirely different paths that they're going to go down. And if you go down that path, you can't necessarily unwind it. So if they're trying to decide what to do, call an escrow officer that you work closely with and ask them to put a net sheet together for you, and then do both. Do like the actual net sheet as if you were selling it, and a net sheet assuming that there's HARPTA applied to it. And the reason why is because that HARPTA withholding is a giant. I mean, that's a monster fee that they're going to pay, and that sometimes will help them decide. You're not trying to coerce them to sell by any stretch, but you again are helping them to make good decisions as a real estate agent, a good real estate agent, and consult with them, and you're educating them. So you want to make sure that they understand the pros and cons of both. So section Q here is don't be an attorney.
You're gonna skip N?
Did I skip in?
Yeah, N-O.
Oh, yeah, I didn't, I'm sorry, you're right. I didn't revise this from before. So make sure N1 is selected if the property is supposed to be vacant. We reiterate that in F2 as well.
But N1 is also just for tenants only, right? That's why we said, put it in F2 because, seller's not a tenant.
Right. Obviously, if the buyer is buying something that has tenants as investment property, you're going to select N2. Section O, which I love. You know what chemo refers to section O as?
What?
Oh shit.
Oh.
Because that's termination, mediation, arbitration, and other matters. The thing that we have control over is, by the way, make sure you understand and have read through. O1, termination due to default. O2, termination within a contingency. O3, termination after. O3 as a firm's policy, I get this back all the time, and Tony has set our firm's policy for that to be between 2 and 3 days. Certainly not 5 days, certainly not 7 days or longer. That's too long a period of time. So make sure that you have that between no more than 2 or 3 days. Is there anything else on this page that you want to talk about before I move?
Yeah, let me go back 1 second. Hold on. I had to do a J1 and some of the language. Okay, so in some of the addenda that other firms have, they have a clause in there that states that typically in a J1 inspection, you have 5 days, whatever that date is, 10 days, whatever, right? On that last day, your buyer either accepts the property or terminates the contract. If the buyer doesn't send in notice, it's deemed that they've already accepted the J1 inspection. And so what happens is in some of the other firms, what they're saying is that if the buyer doesn't send in notice of approval or cancellation, it's automatically extended.
When he says other firms, he's talking about if you've inserted another firm's addendum. That's why it's important to read and understand what the addendum is, because it alters the language of the purchase contract.
So here you are thinking that, okay, you represent the seller. You think that the buyers, they accepted it because they didn't respond to it. And then a week later goes by and then the seller's agent is like, no, you guys are still on the hook for another 7 more days, right? So, or they represent the buyer. Oh, no, we haven't submitted anything yet. So therefore, we're still in our due diligence. And you're thinking that, oh, but your 15 days has passed. Well, if you read our addenda, we haven't sent anything in yet. Therefore, we're going to keep going.
And then there's another good question too, is from Karan. Karan's full of good questions today. If the military owner, or anyone for that matter, rents it out, and then after 3 years they do a 1031 exchange. The 1031 exchange is exactly that. It's an exchange. So no capital gains is due so long as you follow the rules of the exchange. So yes, could they rent it out for 2 or 3 years and then do an exchange and avoid the withholdings as well as capital gains? The answer is yes. Not speaking as a CPA, but if you follow those rules, the answer is yes. But you are also kicking the can down the road, so to speak. So if they bought something else, they cannot buy that. What they're buying cannot then be their primary residence, because that's not within the rules of the exchange. They have to buy another rental property. And should they sell that rental property and not do another exchange after that, then that capital gains becomes due. So you're just kicking that can down the road. But nonetheless, 1031, different class altogether, phenomenal program. A lot of savvy real estate investors use it all the time. But you you just got to understand kind of the nuances behind it. But we've taught some classes on that. I'll continue to teach it too. So it's really good stuff. Commonly used terms, this is section Q. I'd like to think, hopefully this is the case, I don't know if it is or isn't, but if you guys noticed the previous iteration of section Q, it got maybe 60% shorter.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that they did that on purpose because realtors were starting to think that they were attorneys, right?
Right.
Stop writing your own clauses, don't do that. The clauses that we write at RE, meaning the firm, we're reviewing it with the principal broker, with the other brokers, with our attorneys. We have some thought process behind it. We're not willy-nilly doing that. And you want to make sure that you're using approved clauses. So what are some commonly used clauses or statements that you would use here? First, let me just say this. Don't order it, because I've seen this happen too. I've seen like the little hyphen, and then you're kind of making statements on there. It clearly states, if you read it, please number Q1, comma, and whatever you're putting on there, Q2, comma, and so on and so forth. So word it with the right format too. The thing that I use for me, and a lot of my agents use as well, is I'll use a TRR selection right there, which is to satisfy L2, buyer selects blank for their termite or pest inspection. That's a commonly used one. If you have a request that you're making a request for a building permit package, that can be done here as well. If you do that, again, same thing as before, make sure that you do that and allow the buyer an opportunity. So the seller is going to provide it to you within a certain amount of time. The buyer will have a certain amount of time to review it or cancel. Make sure you put that component in there. Escalation clause is very, very commonly used nowadays, especially in this limited inventory market that we're in. An appraisal clause can also be one. We already have a couple of these clauses written for you. If you look in zip forms, it is, and you look on zip forms, and I think it's tools, clauses, and you click on global clauses. Some of those things are there. The ones that aren't, we'll keep adding to it. But those are the approved clauses. Please don't make up your own. One of the things that I've seen is the escalation clauses. People have had either the wrong pages that they're referencing on there. Make sure that those are right. I've also seen ones without
There's 4 pages. If you don't have 4 pages on an escalation clause, then you're not looking at the one that we wrote for you.
Right. And also the pages are clearly defined. So if they're the wrong pages, you're literally asking for things that aren't helpful to you. But also if there should be a cap set on your escalation clause as well. Because if it's not a cap, you're kind of being disingenuous to that whole process.
Unless your buyer says, I don't want a cap.
And if that's the case, that should be in writing. That should be a conversation that you have in writing.
Yeah. Look
at all the comments coming through. I probably should stop and read this. This is the whole thing. Okay, let's see here. Jerry's talking about FERPTA and HARPTA. It coincides with 1031. So if
there's a 1031 exchange, the buyer is not receiving, or the seller is not receiving any proceeds,
yeah,
and therefore it's all deferred,
yeah,
right?
But it is coincide, meaning that if you're selling an investment property, then their HARPTA and FERPTA potentially kick in. So it's still kind of talking about that process. So they're somewhat linked. And the difference between HARPTA and FERPTA is defined in the purchase contract. So please read that. Yes, it is. FERPTA is for foreign investors. HARPTA is for non-Hawaii residents, but U.S. citizens. Someone's asking, Tony, can you explain the time frame again on J1 if it has passed and the other broker does not send in an approval? He's had this come up with a banker who said their attorney said there was no place in the contract saying an approval had to be sent. By the way, so real quick is, as I mentioned before, it's not a right versus wrong in the contract. If you literally ask and call 5 different attorneys, you're going to get 10 different answers on different things. So it's not a universal thing. If it were a universal agreement on everything, there's really no negotiation. Then we could use templates because that's a hard yes or a hard no. But it's all about interpretation and who it favors. So know that just because another agent says, my broker said this, or our attorney said this, or whatever, and they cannot impose their firm standards on us, just as we can't impose our firm standards on them. So Tony, what's your answer to this question? Want me to read it again? Can you explain the time frame again on J1 if it's been passed and the other broker does not send in the approval. This has come up with other firms, and their attorneys said there's no place in the contract saying an approval had to be sent in the first place.
Yeah, there isn't any, right? It's just that you have to cancel within the specified amount of time. And if you don't cancel, then it's deemed that your buyer has accepted, that your buyer has accepted, because you have to refer to section 02. If the party given the right to terminate fails to deliver the written notice to the other party within the such time period, such date, the termination right shall be deemed to be waived. So if your buyer intends on canceling and doesn't do anything, he's waived his right. Does that answer your question?
Okay, I'm gonna move on because there's a ton of questions coming through as well. Okay, this one is probably, I would say, the most commonly, the common one that I kind of go back and forth with agents is that on page 14 of the purchase contract and page 2 of the counter, that section is in the box where it says reviewed by, and it says name of seller's principal broker, broker in charge, signature, brokerage firm. Tony, what is that used for? That box?
That box is only used for notice of rejection. So if you have 14 offers that come in and your seller says, I don't want to reject all the other 13, it's too much time for me, you just send them off to the broker, the principal broker, or the BIC. You check off the box, notice of rejection. That's why it says, well, why administrative rules? So it's a rule. It doesn't say there's no rule that I have to sign for an acceptance of the contract or accepted counteroffer. It's just I have to acknowledge that your offer's rejected. The seller doesn't want to sign off on it, and so they make the BIC or the PB responsible to do that.
So I get a lot of calls that will say, hey, we're opening up escrow. The agent on the other side, so we're on this side or the buy side, whatever, the agent on the other side is asking you to please sign the bottom of page 14 or the bottom of page 2. If we're opening up escrow and we've accepted that, the answer is no, that we're not signing that. That's for rejections only. So if you look on your purchase contract, page 14, if you look next to T3, notice of rejection, and it says Hawaii Administrative Rules 1699-3, paragraph J. I've actually put it on here for you as well. So it's pertaining to the spirit of this thing. This is not new, by the way. This is not new as of the latest iteration of the purchase contract. This has always been in place. What the issue is, if you ever ask some of the old school brokers that have been licensed for 20 years plus, typically they're in the habit of, if they reject an offer, they'll write rejected across the face of it and maybe send page 1 back over, or there's some sort of written notification. That's correct. That's what you're supposed to be doing. For whatever reason, I think we all kind of fell into a lull where nobody was really doing that anymore. The HAR 1699-3 didn't change at all, but no one was doing that. So what was happening in a competitive market, when they went, the forms committee, when they were revising this, one of the biggest complaints that was coming up was, I don't know if there's fair dealings, because I submitted my offer, not realizing that there might be 25 offers received. I submitted my offer, and how do I know that the seller even got and saw my offer, because I didn't get a rejection back. I kind of sent an offer and it went into the black hole, and they never acknowledged receipt of it, let alone rejection of it. So some of the agents were concerned that it was not being reviewed. So that's when they put in this box. Now, again, great thought process, poor implementation is what they should have put right next to that reviewed by is for rejections only. But you can tell it's for rejections only. It says that, it references what statute that it's talking about, which is 1699-3, paragraph J. So if you read that, it states it clearly. Feel free to let the other side know. Again, it's not wrong or illegal or unethical or anything like that for the other side to use this document or use that section to accept it. Now they're outside of the spirit of this HAR, but that's their own firm's policy. They cannot impose their firm's policy on us. When I called the board, by the way, this is when this first came about, I asked them specifically about that. The board doesn't get involved with how you conduct business and the standards in which your firm operates, but they said that that is put there for rejections. If you guys want to use it for acceptance or anything else, that's up to you guys. So again, don't send your BIC page 14 of the purchase contract or page 2 of the counter to sign if you're accepting something. So hopefully that makes sense.
And I know a lot of times, like, you know, some of the agents have called us and said, hey, you know, the BIC on the other side or the broker on the other side is stating that it's not a valid contract until you sign the acceptance. And I'm like, that's me signing for the acceptance or the accepted counter offer doesn't make it a valid contract. They have to open up escrow, and I'll shoot you back exactly what Chad has up on the screen. Hey, you know, school the other broker on the other side and tell him that you know more than he does, and here it is. And then most of the time they just kind of shut up about it.
So here's a good question that came through. If the contractual closing period has expired and the unilateral right to extend has been used and passed as well, does your client have the right to cancel instead of agreeing to any further extensions? And if so, what one or two or three provision do you use?
It just states that any extensions as far as F2 have to be.
So F2 is passed, and then F3A has passed or been used up. Does your client, I'm assuming that you're talking about the buyer, does their buyer have the right to cancel instead of agreeing to any, or maybe the seller, does the seller have any right to cancel? I'm saying yes, they do if you're just sell side, because that's an option.
I mean, then you don't have a valid contract, right? I mean, if somebody's already burned off through F3A.
The buyer didn't perform.
And now it's time is of the essence, right? Because once F3A is used, it becomes time of the essence is automatic. And any other extensions beyond that
bilateral.
Has to be bilateral, right? And you may have one party on the other side saying that I'm going to argue that. And here's the thing. You get 2 attorneys, as Chad said, 2 or 3 attorneys, they can argue anything all day long. Doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's not going to try and force your client to cancel or to perform. It's just that I would say it's not a valid contract, but somebody else may say it's still valid.
Okay, let me switch to this fun little video real quick, please. I love this video.
Dr. Switzer?
Yes, come in. I'm just washing my hands.
I'm Catherine Bigman. Janet Carlisle referred me.
Oh, yes. Fear of being buried alive in a box.
Yes, that's me. Should I lay down?
Oh, no. We don't do that anymore. Just have a seat. And let me tell you a bit about our billing. I charge $5 for the first 5 minutes, and then absolutely nothing after that. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Too good to be true, as a matter of fact.
Well, I can almost guarantee you that our session won't last the full 5 minutes. Now, we don't do any insurance billing, so you would either have to pay in cash or by check.
Wow. Okay.
And I don't make change.
All right.
And go.
Go.
Well, tell
what?
me about the problem that you wish to address.
Oh, okay. Well, I have this fear of being buried alive in a box. I start thinking about being buried alive, and I begin to panic.
Has anyone ever tried to bury you alive in a box?
No, but truly thinking about it does make my life horrible. I mean, I can't go through tunnels or be in an elevator or in a house, anything boxy.
So what you're saying is you're claustrophobic.
Yes, that's it.
All right, well, let's go, Catherine. I'm going to say 2 words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully. Then I want you to take them out of the office with you and incorporate them into your life.
Well, shall I write them down?
Well, if it makes you comfortable, it's just 2 words. We find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay, here they are.
Stop it!
I'm sorry?
Stop it!
Stop it?
Yes, S-T-O-P, new word, I-T.
So, what are you saying?
You know, it's funny. I say 2 simple words, and I cannot tell you the amount of people who say exactly the same thing you're saying. I mean, this is not Yiddish, Catherine. This is English. Stop it.
So, I should just stop it.
There you go. I mean, you don't want to go through life being scared of being buried alive in a box, do you? I mean, that sounds frightening.
It is.
Then stop it.
I can't. I mean, it's been with me since childhood.
No, we don't go there. Just stop it.
So I should just stop being afraid of being buried alive in a box.
You got it. Good go. Well, it's only been 3 minutes, so that will be $3.
Actually, I only have a 5, so.
Well, I don't make change.
Then I guess I'll take the full 5 minutes.
Fine. All right. Well, what other problems would you like to address?
I'm bulimic. I stick my fingers down my throat.
Stop it! Nut of some kind? Don't do that.
But I'm compelled to. My mom used to call me fatty.
No, we don't go there.
But I've been having this dream.
No, we don't go there either.
But my horoscope did say.
We definitely don't go there. Just stop it. What else?
Well, I have self-destructive relationships with men.
Stop it! You want to be with a man, don't you?
Yes.
Well, then stop it. Don't be such a big baby.
I wash my hands a lot.
That's all right.
It is?
Especially during COVID.
I wash my hands all the time. There's a lot of germs out there. Yeah, don't worry about that one.
I'm afraid to drive.
Well, stop it! How are you going to get around? Get in the car and drive, you kook.
Stop it! You stop it! You stop it!
What's the problem, Catherine?
I don't like this. I don't like this therapy at all. You're just telling me to stop it.
And you don't like that?
No, I don't.
So you think we're moving too fast? Is that it?
Yes. Yes, I do.
All right, then let me give you 10 words that I think will clear everything up for you. You want to get a pad and a pencil for this one?
Right.
Are you ready? All right, here are the 10 words.
Stop it or I'll bury you alive in a box!
So that's just a fun little video, but the point of that is some people are stuck in their ways, right? They just kind of do things without really thinking. So if you're still trying to send us signatures for acceptance on page 14, page 2, stop it. Okay, as we wind down, there's some tips on how to stay out of trouble. Tip 1, it is imperative anyone working for you or with you have an active real estate license if they are doing real estate activities. This especially applies if you have an assistant or a transaction manager. Here's a law that states that. It is super, super important. There are actual fines that accompany that. Can an unlicensed assistant host an open house for a licensed agent? Can an unlicensed assistant answer an incoming call for you? can an unlicensed assistant write a purchase contract for you? You know, this is tricky. I would say that number three, absolutely not.
Unless their hands are tied.
Yeah, right. Number two, sure. At the moment that the question goes into how much is this property being listed for, is it in escrow, is it still available? They can't answer that question. They're not a real estate agent, so it's very limited on as to what information they can provide, but it's possible. Can an unlicensed assistant host an open house? You know, if they're there with you, co-host an open house with you, I think that's probably more practical and better. If they're hosting an open house, that literally means that they're handing out flyers and telling people to call you if you have any questions. And, you know, how do you know that not a single question comes up as to relating to the home, the market, the price, or anything like that? They can't answer anything, so they're kind of useless being there. If they are there with you to hold the door open or stand out front and hand out flyers or to kind of manage the crowd during this period of time that we're in, where you're kind of spacing the people that are coming in, then it's possible for sure. But you just want to make sure that you don't do anything to jeopardize your license or the firm's license. Stay in your own lane. So this would come about where I hear this all the time, where someone will go, hey, great news, I just got a new potential client that asked me to list their home, and it's a short sale. I've never done one before and I'm super excited to try. Don't do that. Stop it. Stay in your own lane. This doesn't mean that you can't become proficient or know that skill set or learn that skill set, but experimenting or learning on the job with your client is not a smart thing to do, especially in an industry that we're so monitored with our licenses. So the good thing is, our firm has well over 300 people, agents, and we all come from contribution. We're very collaborative. If there is a client that you get that is operating in an area that you're not as familiar or as proficient in, then just co-list or work with someone else that might be more proficient and ask them, hey, can I learn from you, and I'll share my commissions with you along the way. That's probably the best option to do that, and certainly ask your brokers or what have you for help. Tip number 4, write it down. We say that constantly. You're obligated to write things down. Absolutely do that, and especially, we kind of alluded to this a couple times, if you're getting instruction from your client, which you should be getting instruction a few times, which is, yes, I'd like to make an offer on this property. This is the amount that I'd like to offer. Yes, I don't mind either waiving J1 or in order to waive J1, I'd like a credit of X or whatever the case. There's a few times throughout the transaction that your client is literally giving you instructions. If they're giving you instructions, reply back via email. Per our conversation, I wanted to confirm blank. They don't need to sign it. They don't need to print and sign it. But the fact that you're documenting that and emailing it to them will cover you later on, trust me. Don't use templates. We've already mentioned that before. You can't have a template for represent your client's goals and priorities. They're going to be a little bit different. So make sure that you have a good understanding and clarity as to how this purchase contract works and what everything means. And again, knowing that some things are double-edged swords. So hopefully it's been helpful. Don't copy other MLS listings. So if you're on the listing side, this is just a huge no-no. I see this happen all the time. The MLS is garbage in, garbage out. So that listing agent, just because they put it on there that this is what the HOA is or whatever the case is, it doesn't mean it's accurate. Do your own research, look into it. If you're writing an offer on a listing that agent had put information on, verify it. So if they've said this is an assessment or whatever the case is, call the HOA and find out what that assessment is and what that amount is so that you should know. This is one thing that I absolutely plant my flag in, is do a consultation. The buyer deserves for you to do a buyer consultation. It's extremely, extremely important because, number one, you can determine whether you even want to work with that buyer or not. Some buyers are just difficult, or they might want something that's unrealistic. If you get a buyer that says, hey, I just came from the mainland, and in the state that I came from, you can buy property at 60 cents on the dollar. And that's what they expect here. That's not a good harmonious relationship, especially it's not realistic for what our market offers. So you want to be able to have that buyer consultation and explain to them it's your chance to shine. It's your chance to make sure that they don't leave you and shop you for another agent because you're showing your value. You're going to go in there and you're going to explain what the market conditions are, what they can expect in a short inventory market or minimizing a minimal inventory market like we're in right now, is a great time to explain, hey, we might have to write 7 or 8 offers until one is accepted. That's okay, but you're setting the expectation up. If you don't have that conversation with them, they write one offer and it's not accepted because there's 17 offers that were received, and they might go, oh, we failed, we're moving on. I guess it's time for us to rent. Not to mention, you can also set up things like where their contingencies are, where their rights to cancel are, what to expect during the home inspection process and so forth. Super, super important. And if I can just add a little bit of salesmanship to this portion too, is you can set up things which I've mentioned before, is things like the promise, where you're going to be saying, I'm going to do these things for you, and I expect and hope that you guys would feel comfortable and confident in me that you're going to give me a referral as a result of that. So this is where you want to set that tone. Don't skip a buyer consultation, please. Some people will be a little anxious. Maybe you're a newer agent and you meet someone at an open house or online and they're like, hey, I want to start looking. I'm super excited. Go through that process. Are you pre-approved? If not, here, I have someone for you. How much are you willing to spend? What's your goals and priorities? What are your wants and needs in terms of finding that home? Where do you want to live? Those things are super, super important. So please don't skip that. Tony, why don't you tell us the difference between an amendment and an addendum? Because I keep hearing this thrown around as if it's the same thing. And I'm sure they would love to hear your take on it.
An addendum is when you are adding provisions to the contract. Like, when COVID-19 came out, HAR came up with an addendum. So you kind of add it to the contract. An amendment is when you are changing a specific term or condition within the purchase contract. And so let me touch on amendments for a minute, because I see them coming all the time, and they're changing a bunch of language within the contract, and it just says, oh, change the closing date to this, change the purchase price to this, change that. But there's no reference, right? So if you're going to be changing the purchase price, identify it in section, 1, section C, C2, C1. Purchase price is, earnest money deposit is, additional deposit is, closing days being extended. Well, you should use an amendment to the contract, an addendum to the contract for, changing the closing date, but reference everything so that all the parties can look at, okay, you're going to change this, it's in section D, you're going to change that, it's in section E, and so on and so forth. It's frustrating for the BICs or people on the other side to always try and interpret what is that you're trying to accomplish. And I always say that, this is that if you end up in litigation and your paperwork is horrible, you're going to be left out to dry just because you just don't make correct references and you don't do a good job on your contracts. And we can protect you as much as we can, but we can't be there for everything. So if you're going to send us a contract, if you're going to send us an amendment, send us the contract so we know exactly what it is that you're looking for.
So to add to that too, guys, amendments should be used after it's fully executed, escrow is open. Addendum should be used when you're kind of negotiating still prior to all parties executing it. But to Tony's point in C1, where you're talking about the price, if you're changing purchase price on either document, you should be updating to how it's broken down there should be how you break it down on your amendment. Your amendment shouldn't say, all parties agree that the purchase price is now changed from $1 million to $900,000. That's not enough information. What should happen is you should reference the initial deposit, and sometimes it might not change, but you should put on there what the initial deposits are, what the down payment is, because there's lines on there broken down for a reason. So you want to make sure that you reference that the right way. In countering, for sake of clarity, this is not a law issue, but it's just for sake of clarity. When countering, update the date of the expiration from the received offer. And I have a closed parentheses without an open one. Sorry about that. But what that's referring to Tony's point, is just making sure that you're super, super clear. So if you get an offer and the offer says it expires tomorrow, for instance, when you counter, just update that person's expiration date on the purchase contract. Subject to contingencies, knowing your client's goals and priorities are paramount to how you structure the contracts, be it on the buy side, list side, or both. If your client is purchasing a property but needs the proceeds from the sale in order to buy, ensure that you have them protected with the proper contingencies, either home sale contingency, subject to replacement property, et cetera, whatever other document, make sure you have that in there. And if you need help with how to structure that, that's what the BICs are for. Oftentimes I'll get offers sent to me and I'm asking for clarification, and that's where things come about. You have to take it upon yourself to tell us what the information is so that we can help guide you to that. Closing windows. Contingencies are like windows for a buyer. You want a nice breeze and hope to open as many windows as possible for the ability to cancel the transaction if necessary. If you have a 14-day J1, the buyer is satisfied, but by day 4, do not send in your J1 satisfaction. We talked about this earlier. You can have it signed and executed, but hold it until the last day in case your buyer changes their mind. Remember, you have to hold their best interests above your own. So the way to do this is if you have a TM or TC, you can have everything executed, just instruct them, do not send anything until you run it past me first. And in this case, we'll send it on the last day, but still ask me first before you send it. There are, like little add-on additions in Gmail and other kind of email software that you might be using that you can schedule an email. So you can kind of prepare it in advance on day 4, but not schedule it to go out on day 14 and send yourself a little reminder. So,
but if the buyer's going to cancel on the J1 and you got a J1 satisfaction sign, make sure you also have a J1 cancellation as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And make sure you send the right one in.
Yeah. Is that it? Oh, guys, that's it. That is it. Can you believe it? We made it. And how much time did we make it?
2.5 hours.
In 2.5 hours. It was a long class. I think it was a great class. I appreciate all of you guys attending. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll try to answer as many things as we can.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
And guys, just so you know too, I don't, if I had to grade myself on the understanding of the purchase contract from 1 to 10, I would say that I'm probably a 7 or 8. But I know one thing is when I am opposite of someone else on the other side, I always feel like I'm way ahead of them because I actually, and not because I'm smarter, just because I actually read it. But teaching this class and teaching you guys really helps me grow my skill set too. So thank you guys for that. But you guys got to get your skill set up too on understanding it. It'll just help you in negotiating. It'll help you in strategy. It'll help you with your clients. One tip I'll tell you guys just real quick is this is a crazy market where it's a shifting market, right? So who knows what's going to happen with values and so forth. In some areas, because of the lack of inventory, they're being driven up. We don't know how long that'll last. One thing that I've been doing for some of the listings is if we have a listing and it might be priced a little aggressively, or you might be concerned that it might not come in, but you have multiple offers in hand. What I've done personally is I've shown up or been there when the inspector, the appraiser shows up for the property or for the inspection, and I provided them with all of the full offers that I have. In some cases above asking or with escalation clauses, because that shows them the trend of the market. If they only have to go off of the contract, the escrow that you're dealing with, and closed sales, which is comps, and you can't dismiss closed sales, but in terms of the comps, you might be at a disadvantage, right? So you want to show how many people are interested in this property. That has absolutely done wonders. So if you're on the list side, you have multiple offers in hand, do yourself a favor, show up for that home inspection and provide that appraiser with all those different offers. That's going to definitely help. Let me see here.
Let's see, everybody wants the PowerPoint.
The PowerPoint can be sent to you for the low price of $29.99. I'm just kidding. We'll send all that stuff out.
Credit cards accepted, PayPal.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys are all welcome. Yes, you get the PowerPoint.
Tip number 6 again, privately.
Don't read my private messages, Tony. How dare you? Oh, let me see. Tip number 6. I'm going to leave it there for you. I think that's kind of it. Right, for the most part. Well, Tweedles, you gotta.
Will you scroll through those one more time?
All the tips, sure. Tip number one. I'll just leave it there for a few seconds and I'll move it slowly.
What were you going to say, Chad?
I was going to say there's always room for, for me to grow and learn. I'm definitely not an expert.
Oh, Chad, I tell you, whenever I hear you talk about the purchase contract, it's like I'm hanging on to your every word because I know you understand the purchase contract inside and out.
I'm faking it.
So for you to say that you're a 7 or an 8 is like, oh my God, where does that leave me?
Well, but that's the beauty.
But there's new stuff that comes up for us all the time. Like were you here yesterday? Yeah.
No. Sunday?
Saturday. No, we had an issue come up and it had to do with section I, and then when you start taking a look at section I, it's section I3 and section I4, they're pretty much the same, but what happens if you have two different dates? Which one supersedes? Is the date in I3 or is the date in I4? It both has to do with the seller amending the disclosure statement. So it's not like, we look at this and we know it back and forward, like the back of our hands. It's like issues come up, and then when you start really reading into it, you kind of pick up little nuggets here and there. And that's why it's important, especially like people that are using a TM to write their amendments, their addendums, their contracts. Like, you shouldn't do it. Unless you're doing 200 deals a year and you got a full-time staff on board and they're all licensed agents and they all work well together, like, you should really know the contract inside and out. Because when something comes up, you're better versed to deal with it with the person on the other side of the contract that may know a little bit more than you do. And then you're not caught off guard.
Let's see. One question: if the buyer is satisfied with J1 but decides later to cancel before transmitting J1 satisfaction, could they still use the J1 as a reason to cancel? Yeah, that's exactly the reason why you want to hold that back. That's a great question. So that's the exact reason why you don't want to send that over, because that could happen. You never know. I mean, in the emotion of doing if they're a first-time home buyer, they do the inspection, and during that process, they're super excited about, oh my God, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. But then husband and wife go home later that night and have, a conversation about the cost involved or some of the repairs or upgrades or whatever. And they later decide, but still within the J1 period, that's going to be too much of an expense. That's exactly why you want to make sure that you don't send that over. So yes, that's a great question. Is there anything else as I scroll through some of this? Thanks, JT. Yeah, I learned from doing these classes and taking a bunch of different classes. Again, it's not a right or wrong thing, but my strategy whenever I'm in the position to take a class, I just go, is there just like one piece of information or a nugget, even how to say something or how to phrase something that I can walk away with? And if the answer is yes, and you're able to get that, then you're kind of building a wall or a foundation for your own business, right? You're just making yourself that much more valuable and increasing your skill set. So take little pieces of things that we're saying or phrasing or what have you, and keep building your skill set and your value. Any other ahas or questions? Feel free to throw them in there. And all you guys are welcome. Thank you for saying that. I enjoy teaching this class. This is one of my favorite ones. It might be boring for...
Somebody asked about the pros and cons of dual agency. I think the con is that out of all the lawsuits that we ever see, within the industry, the number one cause is dual agency, because either the buyer or the seller always feels like they've been wronged in the transaction, that you've not had their best interest in hand.
There's some sort of conflict.
There's some sort of a conflict, right? Which is, easy to do. You get, you may say something in conversation to the listing agent who happens to be a friend of yours, and all of a sudden, they take that and they refer it to the seller or the buyers, and it creates a disadvantage to either side. So, and you shouldn't be answering any questions that gives the other side a disadvantage or an advantage, whether you're in a dual agency situation or not. Like, I'll have a lot of agents come to me, or a lot of agents will call on a listing like, hey, are your clients negotiable? And I'm like, well, submit us a full price offer and we can negotiate on the other items in the contract that you have. But I'm not going to tell you what my client's bottom line is. That's just wrong. So you never want to put your seller or your buyer at a disadvantage. And, you know, dual agency, you really have to walk a fine line. Like, you know, you can't, if you get a counter offer, if you submit an offer for your buyer, you can't tell them what to offer, right? If you get a counter offer back from the seller, you can't advise your buyer, you know, to make a counter offer at a certain price. You have to be very, very neutral. You can say, okay, these are the last 3 sales in this marketplace, in this area, and we're seeing properties go 5 or 10% or 3% over the asking prices. And that's how I've just, you know, counseled one of the buyers that I'm working with now is like, you know that when you show up to an open house with me, or you're looking at some open or some private showings with me, there's 3 guys behind us waiting to get in the door. So when you're asking me, you know, what should I offer? It's like, you've got to be, you know, 3 to 5% more than what the asking price is based on, you know, what's happening in the market. But I can't give them a price. I mean, I could give them a price in this case, but I always let them make their own decision. So if they get it, they get it. If they lose out, it's like, well, you told me to offer this and I still didn't get it. So they have to make their own decisions, whether you're dual agency representation or not.
So we're not saying don't do, to one of the questions, we're not saying not to do dual agency. It's really up to you, but you have to handle yourself a certain way. I mean, you really got to dot your I's and cross your T's if you're doing a dual agency. As Tony mentioned,